both of you. Okay. Azar?
Good morning. My name is Amir Pasic. I'm the Associate Dean and Executive Director of the Foreign Policy Institute here at SAIS. I am pleased to welcome you to the Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. We are in the presence today of an extraordinary group of leaders and thinkers in the liberal arts and the humanities. We are honored to be hosting today's symposium on the future of the humanities. And this is a result of a special partnership, really a very American collaboration between an association freely formed, the Council of Independent Colleges, and Cultural Conversations, a program led by a scholar and well-known author, once a refugee herself. It seeks to bring the perspective of the humanities to the policy processes that animate this city. Today's symposium also seems an American partnership in that exceptional individuals are the movers behind our gathering. Richard Ekman, president of the Council of Independent Colleges, runs a dynamic association that brings together some of the jewels of the liberal arts landscape to promote their work and underscore the vitality of their mission. In bringing us the wealth of talent in this auditorium, Rich is in alliance with our very own Azar Nafisi, Executive Director of the Cultural Conversations Project. Azar's program, like the education provided by Rich's members, provides alternative understandings that become indispensable when the unpredictable occurs and a transforming world confounds established certainties. As a university, the humanities are at our core, so our interest in today's symposium is a given. As a graduate school training young men and women from around the world for careers of international engagement and generating policy-relevant research, our interest may not be as immediately obvious. However, the search for perspective and the culture that animates our students to seek and our faculty to teach a Master of Arts when other credentials deliver more broadly appreciated outcomes and more lucrative careers is part of what we are about. In a city where a freestanding research institute can sprout as quickly as you can say hot issue, we search for more lasting connections between the work of a university and the policies that shape international relations. We search for the kind of novel connection that made today's symposium possible. Finally, in addition to thanking the Carnegie and Luce Philanthropies, as well as the U.S. Korea Institute at SAIS, allow me to thank Rich and Azar and all of you for bringing this discussion to SAIS and Johns Hopkins. As you deliberate the future of the humanities, we will pay special attention to the international impacts that have been brought to us through the special American partnership. It is now my privilege to ask Azar to come to the podium and begin the proceedings.
Thank you very much, Amir, for that warm welcome. It is such an absolute pleasure to be here today, and I would like to thank our distinguished panelists and participants and everyone else who has made this meeting possible. I would like to mention one special gratitude to Jake Schramm of Southwestern University. When I was talking there, after my talk, Jake said, "You know what? I have to put you in touch with this guy." That guy, who happened to be an absolute miracle worker and sort of a magician, was in fact Rich Ekman, and the rest, it was not silence. But it wasn't silence, and now we have this wonderful meeting, and it is one of those meetings where I would like to talk much less in order to hear all of you. But unfortunately for you and for myself, I have to say a few words, and I wanted to, our first panel will begin with this question of why humanities. And it reminded me of our great Persian poet, Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, who had said, the reason for the existence of the sun is the sun. And so I really don't think that we need to articulate and explain why we need humanities. The reason for humanities is humanities. But being human, as soon as I say that, I start articulating and explaining why we need humanities. And I'm going to try to put this very briefly within the context of my experiences into the two places I called home. The country of my birth, Iran, and the country that I have now chosen to be home. And, they always thank you at the naturalization for choosing this country. And this time you're really responsible, and the country is responsible towards you, because here is the matter of choice and not just birth. So anyway, I wanted to talk about these two countries because I think the extreme conditions of Iran, as Tezvan Todorov talks about extreme conditions, they in fact lay bare and reveal many of the potentials and possibilities within what we call normal life or a democracy. And Iran and America in one way or another become one another's distorted mirrors, and that is why I wanted to put it within that context. And so to begin with another great poet, Osip Mandelstam, the great Russian poet, he had said that only in Russia is poetry respected. It gets people killed. Well, unfortunately, not just in Russia, as we know. And so we also have the privilege of in a country named Islamic Republic of Iran, which used to be one of the most poetic countries in the world. We also respect poetry a great deal and get people killed, including the poets. And just an example, a recent example, in 2009, after the hundreds of thousands of Iranians came into the streets, actually it was the beginning. It was the inspiration for many of the things that have been happening and as we speak are happening in the streets of Cairo and in Tunisia and in Libya. They were coming into the streets and asking for freedom, which to them is not just culturally determined, but it is universal. They were brutally, as always, they were brutally put down and murdered and jailed, and as at the beginning of the revolution, 30 years before, during the Cultural Revolution, bodies of students and dissidents disappeared from morgues, and all sorts of terrible things that these governments do happened. But alongside of it, the first victims were humanities. This time the government directly held humanities responsible. They called it humanities, ulum insani. They held it responsible for creating unrest and the universities being the seats of Western culture, where it insinuates itself through all sorts of nasty things like Saul Bellow and Wittgenstein or Husserl or whoever. Anyway, the Chronicle of Higher Education had a wonderful article in which they mentioned that one of the former ardent revolutionaries turned an ardent dissident, Saeed Hajjarian, after being tortured and jailed, was brought to these show trials, and there he had to confess that the source of him and others being led astray was, guess who? Max Weber. I love it. I think it is a wonderful way of resurrecting Max Weber, in the Islamic Republic of Iran. And this sort of a thing for none of us is anything new. Any tyranny, any totalitarian mindset, even in a democracy, the first thing that they target is the individual rights and human rights, what the amazing Elizabeth Cady Stanton called art solitariness. The uniqueness, the dignity of the individual, and alongside of that assault on human integrity, on human rights and individual rights, they assault what we call humanities. In Iran, that revolution began in Iran by the first targets, the first victims of the revolution were women, minorities, and what we call culture. The first laws they passed, Iran had very progressive laws in regards to women, were against women, like lowering the age of marriage from 18 to 9, bringing something that had never happened in that country, the punishment of stoning to death for what they called adultery, and and prostitution. And by the way, the targets of those laws are mainly traditional Muslim women and not secular westernized women. And they called all of this our culture. And of course, I was absolutely surprised, and I won't talk about that, how when I came to this country, I realized that many among the academics, in fact, it is surprising to them that people in Iran would read Max Weber. But it is not surprising to them to call flogging people for mandatory wail, calling it religion and tradition and their culture. It would be the same as if I would say that fascism and communism were the culture of Europe, and not St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine or Dante or Flaubert or Austen or slavery was the culture of this country, and not Flannery O'Connor or Saul Bellow or Mark Twain or Frederick Douglass or Abraham Lincoln or Jefferson. Anyway, that is a different story, and I will have to, fortunately for you, I have a very short time to speak. But anyway, what I wanted to show you was how the assault and mutilation of reality, and that is what I mean by layering bare. The assault and mutilation of reality is always accompanied by an assault and confiscation of the way a people think, the way a people look at their history, and the way a people articulate their reality. So alongside of all the horrible laws that they passed and the horrible things they did, they closed down the universities in order to Islamize the universities, which they have admitted they have not succeeded as yet. They have said that universities are have brought to us the worst disasters, and Ayatollah Khomeini called them worse than napalm bombs. And that they are worse for us than napalm bombs. Anyway, to make a long story short, the whole alongside of that, things that have also happened in the Soviet Union, like my friends Nagman Masood would call me in Iran, and they would tell me things like, watch television. Right now they are showing the Russian version of Hamlet, and they've cut Ophelia from most of the scenes, or they cut Desdemona from most of the scenes in Hamlet, and they cut actually Othello's committing suicide because they said masses get depressed watching Sir Laurence Olivier commit suicide on screen. They wouldn't get depressed, being stoned to death. They say, oh, it's our culture, and it's the same as in Soviet Russia, where they cut the death of Swan from Swan Lake because masses would get distressed. And Camus and Sartre and Faulkner and Hemingway were all decadent imperialist Western writers. So the whole point that I'm trying to make is that they eliminate and they kill because they're scared. And what Hannah Arendt talked about, the vulnerability of violence and also the temptation. Once you have bitten of that tree of knowledge, you will never ever be the same again. And that fear of biting the apple was also, that temptation was also something that really bothered them. And the result was that throughout the ages, rather than they changing us, we changed them. So those who had participated in the revolution, those who had put us on trial, those who had created the Cultural Revolution are the ones who are now in jail being tortured and flogged and murdered because they read Karl Popper and they quote Hannah Arendt and could I speak about America and then? I'm very worried about Rich. He scares me. He is so correct and I'm so not. So what I wanted to say was that the reaction was in fact to become more ourselves, because this is an assault on your identity as who you are. If they question the way you dress, the way you are, the way you think as a woman, as a teacher, as a thinker, the fight no more is a political fight. It is an existential fight. And the reason that humanities is so essential to this struggle is because it is not political, but it is existential. And that is why you have Mandelstam and Brodsky and Miloš and Kundera and people like that becoming the resistors and the fighters. And so in Iran, and the interesting thing was that they also wanted to impress you. So they would invite thinkers, or they would allow to invite in liberal times thinkers like Habermas, because they thought Habermas is against capitalism. He would go there and he would be treated like a rock star, you know, but because of the structure of his thinking and not his political positions, he would go against their grain. So he would be existentially against them. Or they invited Paul Ricoeur, and again Nagman Massoud were there. For 3 nights, there would be overflow, rock stars for Ricoeur. You know, people were trying to get in the way they would have tried to, at that time, to get into Michael Jackson's concerts. And it goes on and on. I gave a talk at the Tehran Book Fair where they had to close it down and close down all the lectures. Guess what I was talking about? Modern novel and Shkolovsky and Eichenbaum and James Joyce, the most dangerous names you hear here. So I want to end this part about Iran and just mention a little bit about here and give the floor to you. There is a thread that links the flogging of a young girl or stoning to death of a Muslim woman in the name of Islam to cutting Ophelia and Desdemona and to censoring Max Weber. For us, that was very, very obvious. What about here? Well, the good news about here is that we don't kill our poets. Nor do poets cause people to kill. But we do, and I wanted, a lot of people tell me, that was Iran or that was Eastern Europe, you needed to talk about Fitzgerald. Why do we need it here? The whole posing of the question shows why you need it here. But I just wanted to refer you to Saul Bellow, who in the Belorosa connection asked those who have survived the ordeal of Holocaust, how will they survive the ordeal of freedom? That is why you need it here. And Saul Bellow said, what threatens us in the West is our sleeping consciousness and our atrophy of feeling. And that is why he felt you need poetry and you need music and you need writing in order to save you from that atrophy of feeling. And remember that Lenin said he loves to listen to Beethoven and his sonatas, but they make him soft and tender towards other people and make him want to pat them on the head while he has to crush them on the head. And so that is, and Brodsky talking about every politician that should be elected should be judged on the basis of how much he has read of Dickens and Flaubert. So the whole point here, and I will make this very short, when you cut funds for National Endowment for Humanities and Arts, when you close down the libraries, when you cut music and art from schools, when liberal arts colleges and departments of liberal arts and humanities are in trouble, you know that like the crisis that we're facing today, this is not just an isolated incident, this is an attitude. And it is an attitude that we're facing today and we have to fight. And it is an attitude that in the name of pragmatism is really essentially utilitarian and short-sighted. And it is only humanities that will save us from attitude by taking the long view, but not advising our young people to go and learn Arabic and Farsi in order to become a translator at the State Department, but because they have the passion. Because of that sensual urge that knowledge brings you. And I have hope. I do not accept that attitude. And the reason that I do not accept that attitude is because I remember that we used to stay up at night, all night, in order to make sense of one paragraph by Hegel or Kant or Husserl. And we used to stay up here in this country in order to read together from Tristram Shandy. It was here that we did these things. And it is here that every time I talk to people, quote unquote, ordinary people, what gives them passion? What reminds them that they are American is the fact that there was a man named Jefferson who was so idealistic that he thought that ours are the only farmers who read Homer. So when I'm talking about this now, I want to end it by talking about this as an American. You know, and to say that reduction of humanities to what we have reduced it to is reduction of our reality, the complexity and diversity of what makes us human. And that, in fact, what we should do, I think, and you know, one of the questions in the examination for naturalization was, what are the first words of the Constitution? And it's we the people. And because I'm a novice, I take it seriously. And I believe, and now what I would like to do is that because I don't accept it, what I would like to suggest is first that I hope meetings like this will go on, that this won't be just a one-time thing. And I do hope, I really mean it, we have to do something. And it is exciting. And in times of crisis, to pose ourselves as question marks is very exciting. And I hope that we will pose the questions, like as in today, and then we will invite the students to participate in these questions. And then we will take this out to our allies, like in the National Endowments for Humanities or libraries or bookstores, to get the public, to get the people to understand what will happen to them once they are bereft of what is called humanities. So I want to end by, in fact, reading a quotation from Saul Bellow. He used to say that Stalin emptied Russia of its soul, but Mandelstam and Sinyovsky restored that soul by reciting poetry to fellow convicts and by writing in their journals. Bellow said, "Perhaps to remain a poet in such circumstances is also to reach the heart of politics, the human feelings, human experiences, the human form and face recover their proper place, the foreground." And I think that perhaps this is the gift that Iran brings to us, a reminder of fragility of life, of the rights we take for granted, and the endurance that works of our creative works offer to us, that transcend the boundaries of time, place, nationality, language, religion, and ethnicity. And I think what better place than this, and what better people than you, to help bring what should be brought to the foreground. Thank you.
Thank you, Azar, for that stirring articulation of why we are here today. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Council of Independent Colleges. Now, I should reveal my version of how today's symposium came about. Azar was the keynote speaker at the Council of Independent Colleges Institute for Chief Academic Officers in 2009. It's a large meeting of college deans and provosts and academic vice presidents. And needless to say, Azar was a big hit. And at the end of her remarks, she issued a rousing call to the several hundred deans in the room for a rally in Washington on the National Mall in support of the humanities. You can just hear her doing this, can't you? Well, the response was instantaneous and enthusiastic, and then Azar turned to me and asked in a matter-of-fact way in front of everyone whether CIC could please take care of that. So, well, we're not on the National Mall, but we are in Washington, D.C., in what I hope will be a highly visible demonstration of the power of the humanities. This is not a time today for hand-wringing about declining enrollments. It's not really even a rally about increased appropriations for NEH, nor, I hope, will this discussion turn out to be yet another skirmish in the culture wars that have been going on for 30 years. Yes, 30 years. Another 30 years war. But rather, this symposium is about the humanities themselves, their ability to help us as individuals and as members of society. David Skorton, the president of Cornell University and a physician, not a humanist, has put it this way: we should celebrate the achievements of the humanities. They help us do good and avoid evil, to practice reasoned civility, even to learn lessons from history of how we should, or at least how we could, do better in the future. I suspect these are the ways in which our neighbors understand the fruits of scholarship in our fields, and these are the optimistic meanings of the texts and the ideas and the disciplines we study. And you'll notice that today our definition of the humanities does include the arts. So we're just delighted that so many of really first-rate thinkers and educators have agreed to speak to us today as we go through the day, and I want to express our gratitude to the Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Henry Luce Foundation for their support. Michael Gilligan, president of the Luce Foundation, is here. Michael, can we ask you to stand up? Can we? Oh, there you are. Thank you. You know, when we announced the symposium and issued the first wave of invitations, all of you responded very quickly, and indeed within a week, all 200 places in this room were claimed and a long wait list was established. You're quite a distinguished group of scholars and teachers and presidents and deans and heads of learned societies and educational associations and journalists and heads of museums and libraries and state humanities councils and even some federal agencies concerned with these subjects. There are too many dignitaries in this room to introduce to each one of you, but there are two people I do want to introduce. The first is Martha Cantor, the U.S. Undersecretary of Education in the Obama administration. Martha, your deep interest in the humanities Thank you for being here, Martha. And the second person I want to introduce is George Martin, president of St. Edward's University in Texas. George is the chair of the board of directors of CIC, and St. Edward's, under George's leadership, has, among many distinctions, racked up an extraordinary record of enrolling and graduating in timely fashion first-generation college students, mainly of Hispanic background. George, will you please stand? So here's how today's going to work. The day is divided into 4 sessions with several presentations in each one. The presenters, after making their initial presentations, will have a chance to challenge one another, and then the floor will be open to everyone in the room. We have energetic SAIS graduate students who are here with us who will rush to you with a mobile microphone if you want to speak, and we're trying to allow about 20 minutes or half an hour in each session for open conversation. We'll try to stay on schedule, although I recognize Azar and I have set a very bad example in this opening session with our late start. And the reason we want to stay on schedule has largely to do with the large numbers of colleges and universities around the country where people are tuning into the webcast in time with their classes to listen to one or more of the sessions. We won't have lengthy biographical introductions. You'll find those in the printed program. And at lunchtime, we'll have box lunches for everyone, which you're welcome to eat here or take outside if it warms up a little bit. And then at the very end of the day, everyone is invited to a grand reception, thanks to the support of SAIS's Korea Institute and to the Routledge Taylor Francis Publishing House, and we can continue our conversations informally over food and drink. Today we're focusing on 4 major dimensions of the larger topic of the future of the humanities. And the first, we're going to take a fresh look at those framing questions about the shape and direction of the humanities. And we have some extraordinary college and university presidents who will share with us some new perspectives on these perennial questions. Our second session takes us, I hope, beyond any of the cliches of the uplifting effects on the individual of being steeped in the humanities, and indeed our speakers have some original things to say about that. And then our third session looks outward to explore the usefulness of the humanities as a force in public policy, and our speakers include those who have looked at the question analytically and those who have actually tried to develop and defend public policy on the humanities. And then finally, our fourth session just parts the curtain on a potentially vast subject, the ways in which the humanities operate beyond the academy, through such agencies as bookstores and newspapers and television and libraries and museums and state humanities councils and digital media. So that's our day in a nutshell. There's a lot to talk about, and Azar and I believe there's a lot to be optimistic about in contemplating the future of the humanities. Now, as Azar has already indicated, no gathering in Washington about the humanities is complete without a reference to Thomas Jefferson. So what I want to say is that if Thomas Jefferson's America was a country where he hoped that every yeoman farmer would spend the day walking behind his plow and pondering the Aristotle and Shakespeare he had read the night before, today's version would be Neil Rudenstine or Steve Knapp on a metro bus going to his office with his iPad in hand and watching the latest BBC film version of a Jane Austen novel. So with that image in mind, let me turn the podium over to John Churchill, who will moderate the first section, and Azar and I will get out of the way. Thank you. Delighted you're here.
good morning. I'm John Churchill, Secretary of the Phi Beta Kappa Society, and it's a real pleasure and an honor to bring the banner of Phi Beta Kappa into this setting and to stand before you in the guise of an organization which is, as you all know, very old, and is also, as you all know, dedicated to nothing else but to celebrating and advocating excellence in the liberal arts and sciences, with the humanities, needless to say, at the core of that interest. So I bring greetings from the Phi Beta Kappa Society to today's proceedings. And thanks to the Luce Foundation and the Carnegie Corporation, and thanks, Rich, to the CIC and to SAIS for making this day possible. We have before us, as Rich has just told you, a day-long conversation in a number of dimensions. Our first session is a context-setting session, I hope, a consideration of the humanities themselves, an examination from three different points of view of the question why it is that our interests and our passions are invested in these studies and in these pursuits. In the question, how do we understand the peculiar confluence in the humanities of meaning and contentiousness? The question why the humanities are both centers of controversy and seemingly objects of neglect, and how it is that they manage to embody and pursue our deepest values while at the same time being so prone to disruption and questions and challenges and this irrepressible tendency to push beyond established bounds. Now, to address questions and others of similar nature, we have three compellingly qualified persons: distinguished scholars themselves in humanities disciplines, practitioners, scholars, teachers, college and university presidents, leaders from among the most distinguished institutions in the world who have added to their scholarly expertise and their scholarly humanity also the humanity of leadership. They are Neil Rudenstine, Chair of the Board of ARTstor, President Emeritus of Harvard, Stephen Knapp, President of the George Washington University, and Georgia Nugent, President of Kenyon College. And our presenters will speak in sequence without further introduction, and questions will be entertained after they have all spoken.
Well, I think you heard some stirring poetry a few minutes ago that was really marvelous, and I'm going to unfortunately bring you down to the realm of prose. And I'm very happy to be with you this morning. Obviously, our subject couldn't be more important, and I'm going to address the subject of why the humanities. Why do we study them? What are they for? And what do they actually consist of? So I'll do a bit of analysis, which I hope will maybe sound elementary to you, but maybe will at least clarify some of the subject before I get into other topics related to it. As you know, the humanities shade into the social sciences on the one hand and the arts on the other hand. They are not, we have invented the category of the humanities. It doesn't stand alone as some kind of platonic form out there. And I'm going to look at the heart of them, but we have to keep remembering that they're not anything except something that we've actually invented. Let's put the categories aside one moment, though, and just say, what do we think we mean by the humanities? And in no sense, I'm going to go back to the old original subject, which was literae humaniores, humane letters. And essentially, that meant the study of classical and modern languages later on, and literature of significant texts, issues in philosophy, in history, in religious studies, and works of art. That's really where the term came from. That's what I think we mean by it today. In other words, these are subjects that are centered on human thought, culture, and life in a direct way. In fact, for a very long time, as I'm sure you probably know, they were referred to as the humanity in the singular, not the plural. And that, I think, is where the emphasis really ought to fall. Well, what's distinctive about these subjects? And why should they be supportive? There have been a fair number of books and articles and commission reports lately that have tried to make a pragmatic case for why we ought to study the humanities. And I think this is an important thing to do. It's been brought forward often in order to persuade senatorial and House of Representatives committees to give more money to the humanities and so on. They're practical, they're pragmatic reasons, and I want to just talk about two of them and try to put them in some sort of a context before getting on to the main subject. Well, as we know, obviously, democracies can't, going back to Jefferson, democracies can't function, at least not very well, without an educated citizenry. And in today's world, we probably ought to include a global as well as a national environment in which we have to function. So we need in public service, in business, in the military, and many other professions, people who know foreign languages and cultures. We need inquiring minds that are interested in learning about the diversity of the world's peoples, about their different religions and philosophical worldviews, and certainly about their histories and forms of government. We've been told that if the United States wants to do well in the future, we must be leaders in science, engineering, technology, and innovation. And this is certainly true. But it's only part of the equation because the humanities are urgently needed. It's hard to imagine that the nations of the world will be able to manage their affairs in anything close to a civilized way unless they have some reasonable degree of mutual understanding to help avoid constant serious friction and, worse yet, the deadliest forms of conflict. We need to know how to use the products of science and technology humanely, and that's unfortunately much harder to do than it is to create those products. So yes, we can make a case for the practical or the instrumental use of the humanities, especially in a complicated global universe that we now inhabit. We can even argue a slightly different but important point, that the humanities help to foster freedom of thought and action, and that they are essential to the creation and maintenance of a democratic way of life. Unless we're able to study and look with a critical eye upon historical events and their interpretation, or bases of theories of religious beliefs, or philosophical foundations that underlie different conceptions of government, and a multitude of other subjects, then we certainly cannot be said to be free. And it's a good wager that a democratic form of government will be far more likely to allow and foster such freedom than any other kind of government. And vice versa. This kind of freedom is more likely to strengthen and sustain a vibrant democracy, not weaken it. In short, there's a close relationship between the humanities and our entire conception of good governance. And that's another practical reason for the value of the support of these subjects. I think that the pragmatic arguments add up to a very strong case. But if I were to step back for a moment, I would want to add that the humanities have no monopoly in this sphere. Sorry, I've lost my place, and I hope you'll forgive me. In fact, if we think back to the last congressional election, driven by so much anger and outrage, we might well say that if the voters knew somewhat more about economics, they would have understood that so many of the ousted incumbent congressmen and women were not responsible for the national deficit or the amount of joblessness or home foreclosures or even the stimulus package, or that if big government were somehow mysteriously the villain, the trajectory toward larger and larger expenditures and larger deficits was much greater, obviously, under President Bush than President Obama. Moreover, if people had understood and thought more about a truly functional democracy, they would have realized that one political party's determination to vote no on essentially all legislative proposals put before us was not an optimal way to serve the best interests of the people and the nation. In other words, if we wanted to make a pragmatic case for strengthening our ability to sustain a workable democracy in a globalized world, We could argue strongly that knowledge about some of the social sciences, as well as the humanities, is desperately needed. We should be reading, for example, texts about politics and economics, such as the Tocqueville Democracy in America, or the Federalist Papers, or the work of John Maynard Keynes and Milton Friedman, or Adam Smith, or John Stuart Mill, or Max Weber, or Schumpeter, or Galbraith, or even Daniel Bell, and any number of other theorists and commentators in politics, economics, sociology, and related fields. When dictators take over a country, they are just as likely to shut down free inquiry in the fields that I have just mentioned as they are in philosophy, history, religious studies, and the arts. So yes, the humanities are very important, and they play a very pragmatic role in many respects, but I doubt that they are more pertinent than some of the social sciences in this respect. At the very least, the humanities do not have a monopoly in this sphere. We cannot do with the social sciences if we want to really have the kind of democracy we care about. So let me come back to my first question. Is there something genuinely distinctive about the humanities? I have absolutely no doubt that there is, and I want to suggest that these subjects relate more directly to human experience, to human life and its meaning, than any other set of academic disciplines. I can say personally that this was the most important reason that led me to study literature, history, philosophy, and art. There's a line in Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot when the main character turns to Didi, his companion, and says, "We always do find something, don't we, Didi, to give us the impression that we exist." The line can be read in several ways, but one implication, for me at least, is that we are truly, genuinely alive only when there is something happening to revivify our sense of self. We have the impression that we exist when we encounter and are conscious of, fully alert to, experiences so powerful that we are compelled to ask what they mean and why they stimulate us to search for their meaning. We also exist when we have lived enough and studied and learned enough to give us an increased awareness of who we are, what our shaping ideas and values are, what we believe a purposeful life might consist of, and even, because we can never quite know, what we are waiting for. In short, the humanities are those subjects in which we are most likely to confront ideas about existence and meaning more immediately and more comprehensively than in any other subjects. And they do this because of the very nature of philosophy, religion, history, literature, and the arts. If we explore these fields of learning deeply, then they insist, not just invite, but insist that we consider different ways of living a life, different selves that we might or might not become. They cause us to reflect on the lives of people in the past or in fictional lives that are powerfully dramatized in literature or art, or lives in the narratives of religious texts from the Old and New Testaments to Muhammad and the Quran or the Buddha. Part of the reasons why the humanities possess this power to educate is that they tend to bring us closer to the texture and actual flux of human experience than either the sciences or the social sciences. Not always, by any means, because they can sometimes be analytical, abstract, and theoretical. But they are often palpable, tangible, dramatic, and imaginative in their ability to capture vividly characters, events, and ideas in forceful and provocative ways. When we are reading Anna Karenina, or wrestling with Thucydides or Gibbon, or witnessing the drama of Plato's dialogues, or watching King Lear, or reading Keats, or looking at Titian's Pietà, we know that we are about as close to the vital signs of existence as any representation of life will ever take us. Gaining knowledge in this particular way means looking less for closure or generalizations about human beings and their behavior, but more for insights and illuminations gained either through what we are studying or analogously what we are experiencing in our actual lives, with all their vicissitudes. In this great essay, The Art of Fiction, Henry James captured in a few words how we can learn from experience, whether the source of the experience is in literature and related humanistic studies or in the complexity of life itself. Experience is never limited, James wrote, and it is never complete. It is an immense sensibility, a kind of huge spider web suspended in the chamber of consciousness and catching every airborne particle in its tissue. It is the very atmosphere of the mind, and when the mind is imaginative, it takes to itself the faintest hints of life. It converts the very pulses of life into revelations. James wanted us to be developing a heightened consciousness, always on the alert, with its own store of impressions and perceptions that we have already filtered and named and configured, like that huge spider web suspended in our consciousness, so that all of our future encounters with even the smallest particles of new experience can be captured and registered and interpreted in such a way that they can yield new revelations of significant meaning. In other words, James wanted, as he once said, for each of us to be someone upon whom nothing is lost. In this way, through this process, if we are fortunate enough and responsive enough, we may gradually learn to see more clearly the possible meaning of situations and events, to be better attuned to the nuances and inflections and character of other human beings, to perceive and to weigh values with more precision, to judge on the basis of increasingly fine distinctions, and perhaps to be more effective and wise and generous in our actions. Of course, not all the humanities work in this way. Not everything is dramatized imaginatively or encountered and registered through the medium of direct experience. We know that in philosophy and in theology, for instance, the approach to fundamental problems is usually propositional, through argument and attempted proof, through the creation of systems that deal with everything from epistemology to ontology to ethics and moral imperatives to distributive justice to faith and belief and their implications for action. Here, the methodology is obviously very different from the process that James was describing, but the quest is the same. What kind of beings or creatures are we? What do we know, and how do we know it? What values are to be cherished, and why? What is our conception of a valuable or a significant life? Most important, while philosophy and theology may be theoretical and systematic, they too have to return constantly, not only to other texts, but to human experience itself, to the reality of life as it is lived, in order for them to stay close to their material, so to speak, life as it's lived. Because unless their systems are grounded in observation, insight, and the interpretation of actuality, of human existence, there is simply nothing for them to build upon. Moreover, because philosophical and theological and other systems are themselves inevitably vulnerable and imperfect, we may often end up in those fields not so very far from the place where Henry James left us. That is, we will come away from Aristotle or Kant or Aquinas or Wittgenstein, not with systematic answers that will satisfy all our many questions and doubts, but with illuminations and clarifications that help us to understand life at a much deeper level than before. Conclusive proofs or impregnable theories are not what we will find. Insights and understanding are what we can hope for. Systems fail, William James once said, but instincts survive. Let me begin to close with a final thought that's a potential problem for many fields of learning, but particularly the humanities. It's no surprise to any of us that humanistic studies take and need time. All studies do, of course, But there's something special about the humanities. They take an inordinate amount of time if they are approached in the right way. And the need for this amount of time is now beginning to test the limits of what many of our students are willing or are able to give, especially because the humanities offer them no obvious, useful, or usable results that can be turned to short-term personal or societal advantage. Shall we or our students spend tomorrow afternoon and perhaps many evenings reading Jane Austen's Emma or George Eliot's Middlemarch or any number of significant books? Perhaps, but as a regular part of our lives or our students' lives, the odds of doing so are probably not very great. These and other humanistic works all require the most careful reading in slow motion, as well as precise thinking and perhaps writing in even slower motion. Meanwhile, we live in an era when the pace of life is faster and faster, when time appears to be in shorter and shorter supply. There are many reasons for this, but we know that because of technology, the relationship between transmitting or gaining information on the one hand and searching for understanding and knowledge on the other, that relationship appears to be changing very rapidly. It's far too early to know when and what all the technological instruments, whether handheld or otherwise, will do to the habits of students and indeed everyone over the long run. But it's already clear that many, many hours are taken up by the variety of functions that even the smallest new devices can make available to one. Some of these interactions are positive and can help education and learning very substantially. But there is at some point an inevitable trade-off where the solitude, the concentration, and the time necessary to read Moby Dick or Yeats's poetry or to write about such works is in such short supply that fewer and fewer students may undertake these challenging ventures. We can't yet fathom the extent to which the concept of information is significantly at odds with the concepts of deep understanding and knowledge, but we know enough to realize that this profound problem is now confronting us, and we have barely begun to imagine how to deal with it. When the great cultural anthropologist Clifford Geertz delivered a major lecture in 1994, he talked about his years at a small liberal arts college. The college had a Quaker tradition, but it had been infiltrated over time by many students whose attitude, as Geertz put it, was all irony, impatience, and autocritique. The combination of Quakerism and impatience resulted in what Geertz called a sort of noisy introspection. But this left him undaunted. In fact, it stimulated him to take, quote, just about every course that in any way looked as if it might interest me, come in handy, or do my character some good. He might, as he said, be lost or helpless or racked with ontological anxiety, but he could try at least not to be obtuse, which is, he added, my definition of a liberal education, not to be obtuse. Well, that was another era, and there is no point pretending that most of our students will want to ricochet so cheerfully and freely through their undergraduate years with hardly a thought about their careers. The era and the ambiance which they have inherited press very hard against such an unfettered search for knowledge. Since the early 1980s, our nation has been undergoing a profound transformation of values at an unprecedented, in which the pursuit and the acquisition of wealth, among other things, at an unprecedented scale, has strained and in many places begun to break the fabric of our society. There has been a coarsening, if you'll forgive me, a coarsening of the country's sensibility. And this has inevitably affected young people, including how they think about their futures. When the gap between the very rich and all others in the nation becomes so vast, when social services are sometimes stripped away with very little thought about their consequences, when the implied social contract that binds us all together is steadily weakened, then it's no wonder that our students should be deeply concerned about their careers. and what they may be able to do, not simply with them, but whether they can survive in this universe. Our job, however, and I'm speaking particularly to those of you who work in liberal arts colleges, our job, however, is to help as many of them as possible to explore whatever might do their character some good, as Garrett said, or keep them from being obtuse, or help them find things that persuade them that they really do exist, or encourage them to become persons upon whom nothing is lost. All of us have to participate in this effort, but you at the liberal arts colleges are the leaders directly involved in the institutions where this can actually take place. With your residential communities, your education courses that are general, not always specialized, your excellent teaching, and your concern particularly about the growth and development of individual students, you are together the colleges that can best offer undergraduates the chance through the humanities to learn more about themselves and others, and to think more deeply about what their values are and should be. This task is more than simply difficult, particularly now when the nation and the world are in such a harrowing state of affairs. But it's an essential task, and your commitment to the humanities and the liberal arts has rarely, if ever, been needed more than it is right now.
Well, good morning. Needless to say, it's an honor to follow Neil Rudenstine, and I hadn't thought about the problem of time that he so eloquently framed. I was reminded of Marvell's lament to his coy mistress about not having enough world and time. It occurred to me that our students actually have plenty of world. They just don't have hardly any time. And that gap is, I think, a really critical one to think about. I'm deeply grateful to Azar, Nafisi, and Richard Ekman for inviting me to participate in this important symposium. My focus this morning will be on the first and third of the questions that were posed for this panel in the program, and I should say at the outset that when I speak of the humanities, I'm largely referring to the humanities disciplines as they are studied and taught, and less so to the objects that are studied, although I'll be commenting extensively about those objects and their relation to humanities study. And I should say that in my remarks, I'll be taking for granted the pragmatic considerations that Neil Rudenstine has eloquently listed, as well as the power of the arts in contexts of the kinds that Azar described at the outset of this morning's conversation. So again, my focus is on these first and third questions. First, why does interest in the humanities rise and fall over time? And why don't the humanities remain consistent reference points in academia and beyond? And I think the answer to these two questions are closely related and in fact involve what Neil Rudenstine has effectively identified as one of the broadest as well as deepest sources of attractions to the phenomena that the humanities profess to study, namely the pleasure human beings take in the particularity of lived experience, or as I would perhaps go further to say, the pleasure human beings take in preserving and enjoying particular things. In a fascinating book published just last year entitled How Pleasure Works, Yale psychologist Paul Bloom summarizes the results of a large number of recent studies by cognitive scientists of precisely this phenomenon. Bloom starts with the question of why we value original artworks more than we value forgeries, no matter how perfect the latter may be. His initial example is the outrage that Nazi war criminal Hermann Göring experienced even while awaiting execution upon the discovery that a Vermeer he thought he had in effect stolen from Holland was in fact a forgery, perpetrated by the brilliant art collector and Vermeer forger Han van Meergen. Why, Bloom asks, should we care so much about the origin of a forged work of art if the aesthetic features of that forgery are, as far as we can tell, just as good as those of an unforged original? By the way this the forgery was discovered was that Han van Meergen was himself about to be executed for giving away national treasures of Holland to the Nazis, and the only way he got off the hook was by proving that he had in fact forged the paintings in question, and he did so by actually producing a Vermeer right in front of his judges. So, well, it turns out that the origin of an object makes a profound difference to human beings, and according to Bloom, that difference is built into the way we relate to the objects around us. Bloom regards this human disposition as a kind of innate essentialism in the human psyche. We automatically and involuntarily see objects as connected with their histories in ways that transcend their physical and aesthetic properties. That's why it matters to us whether an image was created on purpose or by accident. And that's why we care more about a picture that was what a picture was intended to represent than we care about what it actually looks like. Hence, Bloom reports on, quoting him now, a series of studies that found that even 3-year-olds would name their pictures based on what they were intending when they created it. Again, no matter what the images look like, it's what they were intending to represent that matters. One investigator found that, quote, even 24-month-olds are sensitive to a drawing's history when deciding what to call it. What these studies point to, it seems to me, is the inseparability of our notion of particularity from our notion of history. What differentiates one object from another, from the point of view of human interest and value, is not what it looks like, but where it came from, how it came to be. That's why there's something profoundly unsatisfying about the idea of replacing a lost wedding ring or a lost childhood toy with an exact duplicate, let alone replacing a beloved person with his or her exact clone, a proposition frequently explored in science fiction precisely because it is so disturbing. I'd like to suggest that an investment in their particularity and therefore in their history is what most deeply and importantly separates the objects and events studied by the humanities from the phenomena studied by the natural and even the social sciences. In science, what matters is not the irreplaceable particularity of the phenomenon in question. In science, what matters is not the irreplaceability, but instead the generalizability and therefore precisely the replaceability of the object's particular history. So it does not matter that we have an investment in a particular cancer cell when trying to understand the mechanisms of immunology. The point is precisely that the study can be applied and the results replicated without regard to the particular origin of the object at hand. Now, at the same time, of course, the aim of humanities scholarship, in contrast to the objects studied by the humanities, is not simply to observe and record particular histories. At least part of the aim of humanities scholarship is to generate knowledge that can be confirmed or criticized by others, and in the strongest and most influential cases, can give rise to general explanations that transcend particular cases. That's what distinguishes scholars of the humanities from the artists and historical agents they study, and is what gives humanities scholars at least a measure of the academic prestige accorded to scientists. Generalization is also what gives humanities scholarship whatever social utility it can claim. For instance, its professed ability to illuminate the interaction of different cultures, to foster certain values, or to criticize traditional assumptions, and so on, these pragmatic considerations that Dr. Rudenstine mentioned. But that's where the dilemma lies, because the further the humanities scholars go in building general explanations, the further they depart from the original source of our interest in the objects they study. What this means, among other things, is that the academic prestige of work in the humanities is inherently in tension. Some might even go so far as to suggest inherently incompatible with the social and cultural prestige such work derives from our interest in the humanities' objects of study. Defenders of scholarship in the humanities sometimes think the way to give it a social standing and public support equivalent to that of the sciences is to defend either the rigor and objectivity of its research or the social relevance and utility of its implications. In fact, however, what the public values in the humanities is their relation to the particular power, prestige, and interest of the objects of humanities inquiry. Not, I regret to say, the more general benefits allegedly derived from such inquiry itself. What matters to the public, it seems to me, is Shakespeare, not the logic of theatrical representation. What matters is the story of America, not the ideological structure of American essentialism. What matters, again to the public, is the experience of entering another world that one can have by reading a novel like Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, not, or at least not primarily, whatever light this experience may shed on the social mechanisms of colonialism. In short, while all scholarship risks controversy, just think of what has happened to scientists interested in climate change. Humanities scholarship is inherently controversial in ways that don't as readily or pervasively apply to other disciplines. This inherently controversial status is quite independent of whatever culture wars may be occurring in any given decade. That's why the dilemma I'm describing is an enduring, and I would contend, an ultimately irresolvable one. Because, in my view, the humanities cannot escape this problem, the best approach is, and always has been, to embrace it and make the best of it. But how does one do that? Well, decades ago, that kind of modus vivendi could be achieved by strongly connecting the professional pursuit of advanced humanities scholarship to the teaching of undergraduates. The unspoken assumption was that families wanted their children to have contact with the prestigious histories embedded both in classic works of literature and other arts and in the emergence of the modern world. Perhaps the most brilliant example of that strategy, at least in the Anglo-American context, was the invention of the so-called new criticism. For those who were never exposed to it or have since forgotten it, it was, which is probably many of us, this was a set of techniques for generating close readings of just about any kind of text, although the objects to which it was mainly applied were shorter works, mostly poems, from the canon of English literature. By looking for certain kinds of paradoxes in a poem's rhetorical structure, one could generate a seemingly endless series of rich and unexpected interpretations. Because they were unexpected and in that sense apparently original, these readings were eminently publishable. So they helped fuel an explosion of academic publishing and formed the basis of countless academic careers. And because the technique itself was so eminently teachable, it enabled countless students with little or no background in literary history to produce extraordinarily sophisticated critical papers that made them seem astonishingly learned and cultured to themselves and others. And by the way, that actually sounds more ironic than I intended to sound. I actually think there were quite valuable interpretations that emerged from that practice. The assumptions that underlay the success of the new criticism long ago faded, I believe, for two reasons. First, because humanities scholarship, under the influence of feminism, Marxism, anti-colonialism, and deconstruction, took a critical turn against culturally prestigious objects. Second, because a variety of factors have turned the interests of students and those who pay for their education in more utilitarian directions. These include the considerations that Dr. Rudenstine mentioned. Well, what now? One possibility is that humanities scholarship will continue to shrink into a specialized explanatory enterprise with no particular claim to social utility or broad public support, not dissimilar perhaps to analytic philosophy. By the way, a discipline I respect, but one that very much has, I think, undergone that kind of development. Another possibility is a return to the kind of commentary on particular objects and their histories that would be seen as enhancing rather than abandoning or undermining an interest in those particularities, and therefore giving people a source of pleasure and interest they would rather not do without. For a while, it looked like the so-called new historicism, championed by Berkeley Shakespearean, now Harvard Shakespearean, Stephen Greenblatt and his fellow editors of the journal Representations, would fit that bill. From one point of view, new historicism was essentially an expansion of new criticism to incorporate the insights and criticisms of feminism, Marxism, anti-colonialism, and deconstruction. The result was a kind of reading that applied the techniques of new criticism not only to a canonical text, but simultaneously to that text's cultural and historical context. For instance, in commenting on a classic text like Shakespeare's Macbeth, a favorite object of new critical commentary because of its dense metaphorical texture, a new historicist would also look at debates about witchcraft that took place in Shakespeare's England and no doubt had some influence on his treatment of the three witches in Macbeth. One thing of which we can be certain is that whatever direction work in the humanities next takes, it will only be a matter of time until the academic and cultural prestige of the humanities once again either converges or diverges in ways we can't predict. I submit that those who care about the humanities should resign themselves to this inherent difficulty and continue pursuing, on one hand, the pleasure they take in art and history, and on the other hand, the curiosity that leads them to analyze and explain without either demanding or expecting a stable reconciliation between the two. Thank you.
Since my college, Kenyon, was kind of the heartland of the new criticism, I want to thank Steve for bringing that to the foreground. With my colleagues here, I'm honored to have been invited to participate to discuss together with you in this symposium the future of the humanities and their role in a healthy society. It seems incumbent on those of us in this opening session of our meeting to situate the humanities in some ways. What do we mean by the term? How are the humanities distinct from other fields of knowledge? And of course, why should we value them? Let me confess right at the outset that I have some difficulty with the collective noun, the humanities. Is it singular? Is it plural? I can't decide. So I'll just confess that right up front. As a classicist and a Latinist to boot, I was amused to find an Oxford English Dictionary reference from Edinburgh in 1869 explaining that, quote, Latin, not altogether without reason called humanity in this university, is the greatest of all keys to the history, the thoughts, and the mind itself of civilized man. Suffice it to say, that is not exactly the sense of the humanities that we'll intend today. But let me offer a different characterization from the OED, which I've modified slightly, as more to our purpose. The humanities are typically distinguished from the social sciences and sciences in having a significant historical element in the use of interpretation of texts and artifacts rather than experimental and quantitative methods. Obviously, this is a definition by distinction. That is, focusing on how the humanities differ from other studies. In my time this morning, I actually want to emphasize particularly this distinction between quantitative methods and modes of understanding that are more historical, text-based, and interpretive. I'm sure many of us, through the course of the day, will offer thoughts on, oh, I've had the same problem Neil had, sorry. Excuse me, will offer explications of what the humanities mean. I want to focus us first on what the humanities are not, and why making that distinction is especially important. This semester, as I'm teaching a course in classical drama, it's perhaps inevitable that my thoughts are colored by Greek tragedy. Calling my concerns about the place of the humanities in higher education and in our national life tragic would probably be hyperbolic. But if these concerns are in fact part of a larger drama in our society, as I believe they are, then the term may be more apt. Let us cast the U.S. as the protagonist in this classical drama. You know the plot line. The hero, powerful and arrogant, plows forward toward his own demise, heedless of the warning voices from the chorus. In this second decade of the 21st century, many ills plague our society. There is plenty for a chorus or a Cassandra to decry. The future of our environment looks grim. Excessive partisanship cripples our national politics. The economy has taken a body blow. The infrastructure of our cities is wearing out. And these are only a handful of the many challenges we face. Yet I believe another threat to our well-being and our future, both pervasive and debilitating, goes unrecognized or even mistakenly welcomed. In this technological era, as we attempt to respond to the many challenges we face, we have come to rely on the explanatory power of quantification, I would argue, in a way that has far exceeded its useful bounds. And this confident dependence on quantification alone as a tool for mapping reality may now actually blind us to important truths. A world of bits and bytes alone has no place for the lessons of history, the nuances of texts, the experience of artifacts. Of course, overconfidence is a pattern very familiar from Greek tragedy. After all, it is not weakness that brings the great Greek heroes down. It is strength, a strength unable or unwilling to recognize its own limits. And our modern reliance on quantification has undoubtedly been a strength. As Moore's law remains reliable, our wildly accelerating capacity for computation has unquestionably enabled unprecedented scientific and medical advances in our world. Heroic strength, though, always carries its own fatal flaw. Computational strategies alone cannot address the complex human quandaries we confront and lead us to a brighter future. Indeed, I believe we've reached a point where continued reliance on the numbers alone may foreclose that future. Reflect on the recent crises caused, for example, by our technological capacities for deep water drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, harnessing nuclear power in Japan, or developing massive agribusinesses which can ship tainted food products such as eggs, meat, and produce throughout the nation and even around the world. By these examples, I don't intend particularly to join the current campaigns for a green world or for so-called sustainability. My point is more general and, I believe, more threatening to our future. To put it aphoristically, our technological skills enable us to execute what we lack the wisdom to evaluate. To seek that wisdom, I believe, we must turn to the humanities. The field of bioethics perhaps presents some of the clearest conundra that we face today. Given what we can do, what should we do? This question cannot be answered by science alone. It's no accident that hospital boards increasingly include a resident ethical philosopher. We can fertilize octuplets, but should we? We can preserve human life in a vegetative state, as with Terry Schiavo, but should we? We can experiment with strains of human disease, as was done at Tuscaloosa, but should we? These questions can never be answered by science. They can only be addressed by the humanities, by reference to history, religion, philosophy, poetry. My former colleague, the philosopher Martha Nussbaum, has been both incisive and eloquent in illuminating the quality of moral imagination, or what she sometimes calls narrative imagination, that may enable us to enter into the life of another, and in arguing for the crucial importance of developing this capacity, particularly in a democracy. Such an understanding does not arise from the analysis of graphs, spreadsheets, or scatter plots, but it may be awakened by novels, drama, poetry, history, and philosophy, by those studies which invite us, perhaps insist that we reflect upon what it means to be human. Writing this fall in the journal Genome Biology, the geneticist Gregory Petsko reflected on what matters most. Excuse me. I started out as a classics major, he wrote. I'm now professor of biochemistry and chemistry. Of all the courses I took in college and graduate school, the ones that have benefited me the most in my career as a scientist are the courses in classics, art history, and English literature. If I've been fortunate enough to come up with a few insightful observations, I can assure you they are entirely due to my background in the humanities and my love of the arts. And he continues, our ability to manipulate the human genome is going to pose some very difficult questions for humanity in the next few decades, including the question of just what it means to be human. That isn't a question for science alone. It's a question that must be answered with input from every sphere of human thought, especially including the humanities and the arts, end quote. Einstein's well-known epigram is worth repeating. Everything that can be counted does not necessarily count. Everything that counts cannot necessarily be counted. This is a basic truth, but in our rash embrace of survey data, returns on investment, quantifiable deliverables, ubiquitous accountability, in short, in our single-minded reliance on the numbers, we stand in danger of forgetting Einstein's formulation. By all means, let us rely on quantification where it is appropriate. The numbers do indeed tell a story. But there are many, many other stories to be told, which require other modes of telling. Oedipus rightly takes pride in having solved the riddle of the Sphinx. Where he goes wrong is in believing he can therefore solve every riddle. Urging skepticism about reliance on quantitative analysis and what it can accomplish may itself seem antiquated. After all, in our post-Enlightenment development of the sciences and technology, have we not, much like breaking the sound barrier, sped past those limits of understanding which may have held back earlier peoples? When we are able to split the atom, splice the genome, and seed the clouds, perhaps recognition of, or even reverence for, what is beyond reckoning seems merely a relic of eras before we had achieved the full powers of our quantitative methods and models, or perhaps not. Let me adduce here two examples of increasing skepticism about the power of numbers alone from the fields of epidemiology and of environmental science. Science journalist Gary Taubes has presented a compelling case against over-reliance on the science of epidemiology. The popular press, he notes, likes to disseminate prescriptions or proscriptions, eat more bran, avoid caffeine, based on research evidence that's often spotty, inconclusive, or downright deceptive because of its partiality. These proclamations, often, much to the public's confusion, reversed within a short time, stretch the research efforts of epidemiology beyond what they can bear, mistaking hunches or hypotheses for findings. And I quote, "The perception of what epidemiological research can legitimately accomplish may have run far ahead of the reality." End quote. The reason, it seems safe to say, is the public appetite for quantitative reassurance, particularly in those areas of our lives, such as health, where our anxiety and uncertainty most reside. The datafication of contemporary life provides the illusion of control, even when, perhaps especially when, it's least warranted. When the Greeks sought guidance, they went to the Delphic oracle. Today, we employ oracle databases to the same end. Professor Sander Greenland of UCLA, author of the textbook Modern Epidemiology, warns that, quote, "the combination of data, statistical methodology, and motivation seems a potent anesthetic for skepticism," end quote. Quantification, even when it is flawed, provides the illusion of mastery. We might call that illusion hubris. Not only in medicine, but in other fields as well, scientists are calling for a more thoughtful understanding of the limits to quantification's usefulness. Orrin Pilkey and Linda Pilkey-Jarvis, co-authors of the book Useless Arithmetic, Why Environmental Scientists Can't Predict the Future, make a particularly strong case that, quote, "quantitative mathematical models have created the delusion that we can calculate our way out of our environmental crises," end quote. They argue further that the common use of such models has in fact damaged society in a number of ways, pointing out that the complexity of the variables that influence the Earth's processes render many strictly mathematical models, their word, absurd. Yet, despite the repeated failures of mathematical modeling, they note, no one ever admits that the models are flawed. Why not? With the advent of powerful computers and increasingly intractable environmental issues, these scientists argue, reliance on quantitative data has proven to be a siren's song. Our society as a whole, they claim, remains overconfident about modeling, accustomed to firm predictions. Even if they turn out to be wrong, people find qualitative models insufficient. And I quote them again, we have come to the point where mathematical models that cannot accurately predict the outcomes of natural processes are widely used and accepted without question by our society. I think this should give us considerable pause. The public is more reassured by quantitative data, even if they are wrong, than by potentially more meaningful qualitative information. Pilkey and Pilkey-Jarvis make a compelling case, concluding that there are no precise answers to many of the important questions we must ask about the future of human interaction with our planet. We must use more qualitative ways to answer them. The humanities don't purport to offer precise answers. What they do offer are alternative pathways to understanding. As these examples from epidemiology and environmental science indicate, we need to recognize or to recall that quantitative methods alone are insufficient to address many of our most complex human issues. These issues require us to develop understandings, to employ the materials and the methods of the humanities. As a scholar of Greek tragedy, I hear from those I've cited in this paper and others the voices of the chorus, warning, urging another point of view, but not being heeded. Of course, the chorus is never heeded. The protagonist continues to believe that he has a special purchase on wisdom, even at the moment when he is least wise. It does not take much imagination to recognize that there are many, many forms of understanding and learning which do not admit of simple measurement, indeed do not admit of measurement at all. Discerning historical causes, inventing a new process, ascertaining one's ethical duty, analyzing political conflict, creating a work of art. All of these are valued activities in the humanities. But what modes of measurement could we possibly bring to bear to quantify that value? Everything that counts cannot be counted. Some stories cannot be told by numbers alone. They must be grasped by narrative, by observation, by reflection. They unfold over time. They are processes rather than products, directions rather than data. Indeed, I think we need only reflect on those qualities and relationships that lie at the very heart of our humanness to recognize that quantitative reckoning is utterly unsuited for understanding, analyzing, or evaluating our most significant human commitments. When the poet exclaims, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways," she does not have in mind a lover's report card. When the hymnist proclaims, "Nearer, my God, to thee," she neither needs nor wants to add by 10%. I'm sorry, the throat has gotten me good. When committed activists chant, "We shall overcome," they don't mean in the next fiscal quarter. The absurdity of attempting to apply measurement in the areas of our lives where it simply doesn't belong was wonderfully critiqued several years ago by my colleague Bill Durden, president of Dickinson College, in his sardonically entitled essay, "No God Left Behind." Great essay. Yet we find ourselves today in a society which seems to have lost sight of Einstein's wisdom and succumb to the fallacious belief that everything can be measured, Moreover, that the measures which matter most are those of the market economy. This is the tragedy in higher education to which I alluded in the beginning of these remarks. For decades, and with increasing intensity in recent years, the singular focus of policymakers with regard to education has been economic competitiveness, understood fundamentally as vocational training. The tragic short-sightedness of this view, as it completely fails to comprehend the importance of basic research, critical thinking, the humanities, and liberal arts as, frankly, the fundamental engines of economic innovation, let alone the means to realize human potential. The tragic short-sightedness of this is an enormous topic and for another time. For now, let me only emphasize that if we value the humanities, we must make clear that there are goods beyond the marketplace, and there are means of valuing which are not only numerical. As the late Tony Judd wrote, modern democracies need to be bound by something more than the pursuit of private economic advantage. And he aptly cited John Stuart Mill. The idea of a society held together by pecuniary interests alone is essentially repulsive. It may not be fashionable to say that there is learning which cannot be measured in value-added increments, or that there are goods that transcend both measurement and marketplace. But it must be said, and those of us in higher education, those of us who are humanists in whatever field, must have the courage to say it. Perhaps we must become the chorus. Of course, in Greek tragedy, as I said, the chorus is never heeded. But disregarding their warnings, the protagonist never survives. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. And before opening to a broader conversation, let me invite any of our panelists to make any further comment they'd like to at this stage. In that case, we turn to the chorus. Yes, sir. In the middle.
Thank you for your proposition, but may I try to reverse
Could you identify yourself as you begin your question, please?
I'm Reynolds Verrett. I'm the provost at Wilkes University. I'm the provost at Wilkes University in northern Pennsylvania.
Thank you, sir.
Reynolds Verrett. If I could reverse your argument, and I would propose that Greg Petsko's commentary suggests that many more scientists have a deeper understanding of the humanities than the humanities have the sciences. And I think the problem in quantification is the misunderstanding that science will provide an absolute answer. As I tell my own students, I was born under nine planets. Today I'm living under 8. So science does not provide those answers. That misunderstanding by lawyers, politicians, the entire community of journalists is part of the problem. So is it that within our institutions we struggle to see how do we create the bridges between the humanities, the social sciences, and the natural sciences? In that struggle, how do you see us bringing that forward? Because I think part of the problem is that gap. Because I think the way we have segregated the academy.
Well, of course, the argument you're making is C.P. Snow's argument in The Two Cultures, exactly, right, where he identifies, what is it, in the 50s, late 50s, exactly that point, that scientists are typically more familiar, more conversant in the humanities than the other way around. And I fear that does still hold true, and I see it on my own campus, this separation between the scientists and the humanists. The scientists often willing to cross the path and take courses in the humanities. The humanists much less willing to enter into sciences or mathematics. So I think that unfortunately holds true this half century later. And I guess I would agree also with your other point. I think it's not what I was decrying here in my choral outburst was, I think, in fact, not so much the work of scientists themselves, but the love affair that the public has developed with the possibilities, the erroneous understanding of the possibilities of pure quantification. So your point's well taken. Thanks.
Yes, sir.
I'm Robert Darnton from Princeton, from Harvard University. It was the sight of Georgia that moved me. But actually, I have a question for Stephen Knapp. I thought you made a very powerful and convincing argument about the importance of authentic objects, and you stressed that they are connected with history. You rather deprecated the new criticism, I thought also convincingly. What do you view about texts that are digitized? Because they are decontextualized, cut off from their history, from their physical presence in books. Do you think that the way students are now consulting overwhelmingly digital texts rather than text printed in books is part of the problem that you were trying to expose, or would you modify your views and see some promise in the digitization of actual objects?
Well, very interesting questions. I mean, I think that, Professor Darn, I think that the digital cuts both ways, right? Because on the one hand, it certainly makes accessible works that preserve all the intentional integrity that one would imagine. I mean, if you're reproducing books and making them available to people who otherwise have a hard time having access to them. I mean, I'm in the unfortunate position I think many university administrators get into, where now when I get something in hard copy, I ask them to send it to me online so I can read it on a screen, which is a little weird for a former English professor, who actually still is in some sense an English professor, as my staff keeps telling me when I correct the grammatical errors on their memos. The other side of it, though, of course, is the phenomenon that I think is very powerful right now, something like Wikipedia. And what's curious about that is that really is a sundering of a relationship with an author, and indeed makes it very difficult to reconstruct the historical account of a text in ways that I think none of us could have anticipated would have been possible. I mean, there is something very eerie about reading and being convinced by an encyclopedia article with no sense of what the authority is behind that article, and yet there are these scary discoveries that one keeps making. For example, that now physicians who are pressed for time like everyone else, if they want to look up information about a drug, they're just as likely to go online and Google the name of the drug as they are to go back to a standard reference work. So there's something very seductive and I think pervasive about the attraction of being able to have this information at your fingertips, but it does indeed defeat very often an effort to have a sense of what the history of these documents might be. So the digital does seem to me in that way to cut in a couple different directions. Now, I think, take a document like the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, which of course poses exactly the same problems that Wikipedia poses. I mean, there are constantly debates about, who's a framer, who's a ratifier of something. I mean, where does the authority lie in that text? And in fact, a lot of the concerns that you might raise about digital products today could easily be raised about collectively authored documents from the past that have had a tremendous amount of power. And I think you'd find many of the same theoretical questions recurring in those two different domains. I actually don't think that the fact that you have collective authorship necessarily means that the power of the object historically as something irreplaceable necessarily disappears. And I guess the Constitution would be a good example of something that's on sort of both sides of that divide. So I think these are very important questions. We're not going to get away from the digital. Our students are indeed, it's an astonishing thing that I know that my children, for example, who never open a newspaper, read more newspapers in a day than I do because they surf through a series of these online services that aggregate news for them. It's not going to go away. I think the humanities have got to take it into account. Humanities disciplines have to take it into account. Humanities teaching has to take it into account. And I have to say that, when I speak to younger faculty who have sort of figured out how to use these materials in creative ways, they show the same passion and enthusiasm that I remember from, my own early days as a faculty member. So that gives me some encouragement that this is not a sort of disastrous crisis that we're facing here, but it is going to mean, I think, some radical changes in the way we think about these objects and the way we use them in the classroom and elsewhere.
Yes.
I think, just going back to your original formulation, Bob, I think the transposition of humanistic material from one medium to another, I don't think that need be any more alienating than when we were reading printed texts that were originally penned. You know, so the digitization itself, I think, is not terribly problematic, but more interesting to me is this: we really are seeing the death of the author in Wikipedia. I mean, there is no author, right? That's a much more interesting sort of philosophical question, I think, than the simple medium.
Yes, please.
Peter Logan, Temple University. Thank you to all three of you. A question for Stephen Knapp. I really admired the way you parsed this problem and posed it in these very specific terms about the difference between scholarship and the originality of objects. It's very compelling. One of the things I'm thinking about as I hear this, of course, is that the two aren't as distinct as they seem. For instance, the public admiration for the originality of objects it doesn't come from nowhere, and one of the places it does come from is from the scholarship that's produced on these objects. So I wonder if you could say a few words about the interaction between the two terms of your argument instead of thinking about them as being separate and on distinct tracks.
Yeah, there's certainly an ongoing dialogue here between, you know, producers and critics or analyzers or explainers of art, and I mean, I think that's often been commented on. In fact, there's often, in many cultures, a quite healthy interaction between them, and because my own period of focus in scholarship early on was the English Romantic period, and you take a figure like Coleridge and, you know, the difference between commentary on the one hand and original creation. Well, it's complicated further by the fact that he was a rampant plagiarist. So he had a very interesting relationship to originality, although it was what he was most interested in at some level was the whole phenomenon of originality. And so that kind of vital interchange between artistic production and explanation, I think, is something that is not all that different from what I was saying about the relationship between undergraduate teaching and advanced humanities scholarship, that they sort of come apart and then you know, reconverge in ways that themselves have a rather interesting history. And what I was just I think wanting to point out is that there's never going to be a fusion, there's never going to be a perfect reconciliation, there'll never be a final solution as a result of which we'll understand the relevance of humanities scholarship or to be able to defend it to those who think of it as in some sense betraying the originality of the objects that are being studied. That's a perennial issue. I actually had a little sort of working title for my talk this morning, which was the enduring dilemma of the humanities, and I do think it's an enduring dilemma.
Neil, I wonder if you'd like to comment on these questions about the transposition of objects of study, whether texts or other objects from one medium to another, particularly in view of ARTstor's projects.
Well, I'm not so worried about is this on? Yeah. I'm not so worried about the transposition because I think it can be done in ways that are very valuable and enlightening. And I do agree with Bob that there's certain things that can be easily lost when you move away from the original text, particularly if there are specific editions of the kinds of materials you work with. But I'm not so worried about that as I am about what I mentioned before, i.e. the amount of trade-offs that we have to watch carefully between time spent in real thought, real concentrated reading and thinking, and time spent essentially communicating with other people and thinking about information more than about knowledge. I came down just by chance on the Metroliner the other day, and there were two young students next to me, and it's a 3.5-hour ride, and they were watching comic films on their laptop for all 3.5 hours. Now, there's no reason why they shouldn't watch comic films on their laptop for 3.5 hours, but it just occurred to me that in another day, they probably would have been reading maybe a magazine, maybe a book. I'm not quite sure what. But the seductiveness and the ease with which, one, you always feel you must be in touch with somebody. So the phone is there, or I don't even know the terms anymore. I'm so out of it. I'm completely out of it. But the connectivity to other people and the world just seems to me to be so rampant now that kids who are not in touch feel that they're left out. It's very hard to be alone. It's very hard to be lonely for a lot of these students, and that doesn't inevitably cut into, I think, what you need to do if you're a humanist.
Yeah. Yes, this will have to be our last question, please.
Jeffrey Myers, I teach history at Knapp University. There are probably more people in the room some days than we have on campus. I want to ask you about how sort of pop culture fits into all this, because this seems to be one way to get to objects, and then dialogue about how do you use this. I was at the Lincoln Memorial, and I told my colleague that I bet in the next 5 seconds somebody's going to say Forrest Gump. And they did, because that's the point of reference, that's the point of dialogue there. So I tell my students, you have to just make peace with that. If you worry about belt buckles in World War II movies, you'll miss anything that you can use. So how do you make peace with pop culture is my question.
Who'd like to take that?
I'll start it out because actually we had some conversation before this panel, and Neil raised the point that we sometimes, I think, define the humanities too narrowly as only something that exists within the academy. A colleague of mine was fond of saying that the classics are not dying. They're alive and well in Hollywood and on television and everywhere else. And I do think we ignore those pop expressions at our peril, however distasteful they sometimes are. I'm not a fan of Xena, but there it is. So
I guess, I might just add that I think that a lot of humanities scholars have found themselves branching out into studies of pop culture, and partly that is sort of, partly it's a bid for relevance in a way. I mean, it's a way of trying to engage students and so on. Some of them have become, however, quite interested in exactly this kind of connection between, say, classical motifs and their recurrence in popular culture. But then the same dynamic then occurs, which is that you get, on the one hand, it attempts to provide almost a kind of social scientific survey of things that does produce more general explanations that I think then moves away from those objects and begins to generalize about them. Or you get people who really get seriously intellectually interested in the dynamics that produce those objects, and then they're doing old-fashioned, whether it's from a new critical perspective or something more recent than that, they're doing, old-fashioned humanities work on those pop cultural objects. And I think you see that whole spectrum in the engagement with pop culture. One thing is certainly the case is that there's a lot more now after the attacks on the canon took place in the 60s through 80s, basically, than there was, in the 50s when the new critics really had a fairly tightly defined canon at places like Harvard, Yale, and Kenyon.
I wouldn't take on the issue of pop culture. Myself, I guess one of the things that seems to me to be characteristic of the era we're in, though, is the extent to which so many of the humanities, at the core of the humanities, have moved outside of the academy. And I think particularly in religious studies there, where essentially anything the academy says about the nature of this, that, or the other thing in religious scholarship is automatically rejected by a huge number of people because they're not really interested in studying the large parts of the humanities in a scholarly way inside the academy or outside the academy. They're getting their humanities in popular ways, sometimes good, sometimes not, but sometimes I think to enormous detriment of what can actually be achieved in the society.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, let me thank you all on behalf of the panel for your kind attention and these stimulating questions. It's time for a break. Let me remind you that there are refreshments in the back, and we will reconvene for the second session at 10:45. And please join me in thanking our panelists.
Great pleasure. Nice to meet you. Thank you. Are you reading off an iPad? Yes. Well, proof of a new world. It means that you can keep making changes to the last minute to be able to read.
Well, let me start by thanking once again Azar and Rich for bringing us together today for this important conversation and also for the ongoing work that's being done by the Council of Independent Colleges and also by the Cultural Conversations program here at SAIS. Our first panel set the day's agenda by exploring in broad terms the value of the humanities and their changing status. We're now focusing on the humanities, the individual, and society. The questions that the next three speakers were asked to address are very important, but quite frankly, they look a bit rhetorical, since I doubt that any of our panelists will dispute the premises underlying the questions, namely, and I'm quoting now from the programs that we all have, that the humanities can clarify fundamental conceptions of humanity, that they are necessary for a healthy democracy, and that they can foster continuity and cohesion in a fragmented country. Of course, if anybody wants to dispute those assertions, that's the sort of discussion that I would really love to moderate. But it's more likely, I think, that there will be such widespread agreement among us today that we will seem to be preaching to the converted. And for that reason, I decided to take Rich up on his invitation to offer just a few preliminary remarks of my own. I thought that I would pose some additional questions that are different from those in the program. They're questions that might be more appropriately asked later today, perhaps after the fourth session. But they do lurk, I think, behind each of our four panels, and there might not be unanimity among us about their answers. The first question is whether we can actually provide evidence for the claims that we are making today about the value and the importance of the humanities, or are they simply articles of faith? Next, do the humanities as they're currently practiced, particularly in the academy, ever fall short of the claims that we make for them here today? And if so, what can we do to improve our practice, to bring it into line with theory? And finally, and this may be the same question simply phrased differently, underlying the rhetoric of crisis is the assumption that our problems are in large part the result of external factors. But to what extent are the humanities themselves also responsible for the current situation? When it comes to external factors, perhaps you'll indulge me if I could just share with you a rather good example, the report of the National Governors Association, which just came out a couple of weeks ago. It calls for reform of, and I'm quoting, an often hidebound system of post-secondary education which bases curricular decisions on the expertise and interests of faculty, the interests of students, and other internal criteria, and the word internal is highlighted there. Instead, educational content and pedagogy should align with market needs, and funding should be based on performance measures reflecting those needs. Obviously, the report says nothing about the humanities, but focuses on technical fields in which there are serious shortfalls. On the other hand, 2/3 of the core competencies on which the report focuses are those which we associate with the humanities, even though, as Neil Rudenstine reminds us, they're not all exclusively the province of the humanities. Critical thinking and analysis, the power to imagine and to create, problem solving, ethics and integrity, oral and written communication, foreign language fluency, but also global understanding and an ability to function in culturally diverse environments. It's striking how this list is almost identical to the sorts of knowledge and skills that Martha Nussbaum endorsed in her recent manifesto, Not for Profit, in which she takes issue with narrowly vocational, market-driven forms of education, while at the same time making the case that the humanistic education we need, both as individuals and as members of democratic societies, the topic of our second panel, is also good for the economy. I take to heart the unease expressed today about utilitarian arguments for the humanities. As Azar has said, the reason for the sun is the sun. But insofar as government and business leaders give us this opening, should we take it? Can we support our claims without resorting to distorting quantification or oversimplistic assessments? In just the past month, 2 studies have come out that move us, I think, beyond this position. The first is the Teagle Foundation volume, edited by Donna Hyland and Laura Rosenthal, Literary Study, Measurement, and the Sublime, that tackles some of these objections head-on and explores ways of assessing learning at the disciplinary level. The second book, Academically Adrift, by my colleague Richard Aram and Josippa Roxa, focuses on overall as opposed to disciplinary learning. And it makes the case that almost half of the students in the data set they study after 2 years of college demonstrated no improvement in critical thinking, complex reasoning, and writing. In this otherwise bleak picture, the brightest spot is that students who showed most improvement were in liberal arts programs, including humanities programs. So it ought to be possible to build on this finding, to adapt these methodologies, to create even more nuanced assessments that would validate the claims that we're making here today. Now, unfortunately, the study also suggests that we, even humanists, might be able to do a better job. The low levels of learning documented by the authors correlate with the fact that a large percentage of the students they studied do not have courses in which they are asked to read much or write much. In other words, students learn more if we ask more of them and of ourselves. And this applies not just to workload, but also to the content of our curriculum, to the types of pedagogy we use, and also to the sort of questions we ask in our research, the topic that Stephen Knapp addressed earlier today. At this point, I think I will just stop having raised those questions and turn to our panelists. It would be hard to think of 3 individuals better suited to advance our conversation. A preeminent philosopher whose work on such topics as cosmopolitanism and morality is central to our humanistic discourse. A foremost poet and critic whose writing exemplifies the power of the arts and the humanities, even as the foundation he leads supports the creativity of others. And the visionary dean of a college that has made a very distinctive commitment to the liberal arts. Each of these panelists will speak for 15 to 20 minutes, and as in the past, we will reserve questions for the end. And now, would you please welcome our first speaker, Anthony Appiah, who will be followed by Edward Hirsch, and then by Victoria Mora.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm just going to get going. 20 minutes isn't very long. But thank you all for inviting me. Thank you both for inviting me. In looking back on the great works of genius in former times, we are sometimes disposed to wonder at the little progress which has since been made in poetry and in the arts of imitation in general. So William Hazlitt, at the beginning of the third of his lectures on English poetry, delivered early in 1818. This lecture was on the subject of Shakespeare and Milton, and the puzzle Hazlitt was dealing with is surely a real one. Why was the poetry of his day not obviously superior to the works of these 2 great English poets, in the way that so many other things in his day, from politics to medicine to the physical sciences, so clearly were superior to their Elizabethan and Restoration counterparts? Hazlitt takes up the theme and borrows the text from an essay first published in the Morning Chronicle in 1814 and republished in his essay collection, The Round Table. That well-known exploration was entitled, Why the Arts Are Not Progressive, a Fragment. The heart of Hazlitt's answer to this question is to be found pretty much word for word in each of these 3 places, so he must have liked it. It's encapsulated in the characteristic sentences that follow, and these 3 sentences occur in all of those 3 places. What is mechanical, reducible to rule, or capable of demonstration is progressive and admits of gradual improvement. What is not mechanical or definite, but depends on feeling, taste, and genius, very soon becomes stationary or retrograde and loses more than it gains by transfusion. For most persons, finding what wonderful advances have been made in biblical criticism, in chemistry, in mechanics, in geometry, astronomy, etc., i.e. in things depending on mere inquiry and experiment or on absolute demonstration, have been led hastily to conclude that there was a general tendency in the efforts of the human intellect to improve by repetition, and in all other arts and institutions to grow perfect and mature by time. Hazlitt thinks, in short, we can expect progress only in domains reducible to rule. Now, I'll return to Hazlitt's questions later, but let me point out, and his answer, but let me point out first that in an age of magnificent progress in the sciences, pure and applied, we humanists have to be able to answer a different question, one very like Hazlitt's question, and I think connected with it. The knowledge we acquire, the learning we transmit, the transitions we inherit and study and value, presuppose the continuing pertinence to us here and now of human artifacts made by others long and not so long ago, and far and not so far away. And the question is why? Aristotle is only an obstacle to our understanding of biology. Even Newton's physics can be safely, his Principia, can be safely ignored by the modern student of physics. So why do humanists return to the past if what we seek is the truth? If Hazlitt's answer is right, one reason some of these objects remain worthy of our attention is that they have a kind of excellence that has not been superseded. And that would help with the question that we have to answer, since I don't think our civilization is so degraded that we have to defend giving attention to what is excellent. But accepting Hazlitt's claim that the arts are not progressive is not enough to defend the continuing relevance of humanistic study of the past. For by the humanities, clearly, we mean more than what he meant by poetry and the arts of imitation. We mean, to begin with, as I've recently assumed, not just so much the practice, but the study of these things, and also the study of the widest range of the cultural artifacts of human civilizations, past and present, including artifacts that no one would claim to find interesting because of their excellence. So I want to focus briefly today on a defense of a study of the long ago, not because I have no interest in the far away, but in an age of globalization, I think the message that we need a cosmopolitan education has been widely accepted, both here in the United States and around the world. So, why do we in the humanities insist on the continuing relevance of the works of the past? Well, let me begin by exemplifying the continuing utility of a humanistic education by revealing that the very word humanities elicits from the recesses of my memory a passage from the beginning of Cicero's oration in defense of Archias, the poet, which I happened to learn in high school. This is my rough translation of one sentence. It being a Ciceronian sentence, it takes a while to read. For when Archias first left boyhood and turned from those arts by which young boys are gradually molded, and I'm not going to translate this, molded ad humanitatem, he devoted himself to the study of writing, first of all at Antioch, for he was born there in a noble place, which was formerly a famous and rich city, abundant in the most learned men and the most liberal studies, and there he succeeded speedily in showing himself superior to all in talent and in fame. Now, it's true that humanitas can mean just humanity or human nature, but it's clear enough that what Cicero has in mind here when he says ad humanitatem, being formed ad humanitatem, is a second sense of the term, one that in Lewis and Short's Latin dictionary is explained like this: mental cultivation befitting a man, liberal education, good breeding, elegance of manners or language, refinement. And picking up on the mention of a liberal education in the dictionary there, let's recall another phrase that goes with humanities, namely the liberal arts. Cicero refers to these when he says of Archias' native city of Antioch that it was liberalissimis quae studiis ad fluenti, rich in the most liberal studies. Now, the Studia Liberales were, of course, studies, to borrow again from Lewis and Short, studies befitting a free man. When Cicero says Archias' boyhood education molded him ad humanitatem, he must mean that it provided him with an upbringing befitting a gentleman, a free man, and he must have understood that such an education would produce a kind of cultivation and refinement that was eminently worth having. Now, we're naturally suspicious these days of these ways of marking distinction, because they refer to a contrast between freemen and slaves, or between gentlemen and what Hazlitt would no doubt have called the lower orders. So if, as Pierre Bourdieu argued, the function of humane or literary cultivation were just to mark us off from the vulgar, then the humanities conceived this way would aim at an undemocratic end that I, like you I imagine, couldn't endorse. But Bourdieu's thesis is not something I'm even slightly inclined to accept. That a humane education can permit you to show off, I don't want to deny. So can long practice at golf, but that's hardly the best argument against golfing. The reason that I have no difficulty in defending the idea of the humanities as an education for free persons is that one of the great achievements of the modern world has been to establish a global consensus that we ought all to be free. In that sense, the central dogma of liberalism, that individuals are all entitled to live lives of their own, lives in which the central shaping decisions are not to be settled for them by a master, is increasingly the common property of mankind. If you doubt me, you have only to listen to the voices on the streets of Cairo, of Tunis, of Damascus, or of Sana'a, or to read the impassioned essays of Liu Xiaobo. And if you are to discharge the terrific responsibility of making a life of your own, then you surely need all the help you can get. So why does an education in the humanities, an education ad humanitatem, provide part of the help you need? After all, you might think that the necessary answers are to be found from the sciences. Psychology and neuroscience tell me what it takes for a normal person to achieve satisfaction. Economics and political science help you think about the effects of public policies. Physics and chemistry and biology tell you how the world works, so that you can take from it what you want. All that is true. But who is going to tell you what satisfactions are really worth having? What effects worth aiming for? What is worth wanting? Who will help you to decide whether John Stuart Mill was right to say it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied? Indeed, who will let you know that that question is worth asking? And where will you learn that one reason for studying the sciences is that understanding how the universe works is worthwhile in itself, even if you never put the knowledge to use in making a buck? Well, the answer, of course, is evident. These are the questions you learn to face, learn to live with, learn in the end, provisionally at least, to answer with the help of literature and the arts, critically appreciated through the study of philosophy and history and cultural anthropology. I realize that I probably sound like Polonius, rabbiting platitudinously on, and you may feel that, like Laertes, the proper response is humbly to take your leave, which is what he does after that speech, especially since I'm not your father. So let me make what I hope is a less familiar point, though it's, when I wrote that, I didn't know what Stephen Knapp was going to say, so it's already familiar to you. The humanities are not just different from the sciences in providing us with a different kind of guidance in the making of our lives. They are different also in several profound ways in the character of their aims. And here are three such crucial distinctions. First, while generalizations like the great vowel shift from Anglo-Saxon to Middle English, for example, have been discovered in the humanities, they are put to use in our studies, and this was Stephen Knapp's point, in order to illuminate particular things. The universal in the humanities is in the service of the particular to offer a formulation. And this is, of course, because of the deeply ideographic character of much humanistic work. We attend to a particular poem, a particular painting, a particular symphony. Each is a worthy object to study, not just because it reveals something about art or the human spirit in general, but because it is itself worth explicating. Natural scientists, as President Knapp said, are not interested in individual things. This organism, this molecule. They're interested in what they instantiate. They're driven by the nomothetic urge to discover general patterns. That's why Darwin's Origin of Species repays our attention, even though it is no longer by any stretch of the imagination the best scientific account of its subject. This contrast between our ideographic interests and the nomothetic urges of the sciences is connected with a second contrast, which has to do with the point of attention to those particulars that concern us. One central humanistic aim is to explicate those particulars. Narrative as a form of exegesis is one form of explication. We tell the story that explains the meaning. But explication has many modes. We can offer to place a sign within a system of signs, within a system of rules, prosodic rules, formal rules, semantic rules. But not any explanation of any humanly made thing is central to the project of the humanities. There are too many particulars to attend to them all. We pick and choose among them, and this is my third difference, we pick the ones that are significant for certain kinds of human purposes. Now, human purposes evolve and cannot be catalogued in advance. Tempora mutantur, et nos et mutamur in illis. But whereas one E. coli will do as well as another for biological study, not any old pot or painting or verse is worthy of sustained attention. There's an answer to the question why there are more essays on Rembrandt's paintings than on Riesdael's, accomplished as the latter no doubt was. There's a reason why Mozart's works have received more attention than Salieri's. And there's a significance to the greater interest in Jane Austen than in Wilkie Collins, both of whom I've enjoyed reading. The work of the humanist requires the complex evaluations that underlie these differentiated patterns of attention. Hazlitt's recognition that the arts were not progressive is right, I think, but not because the arts are not reducible to rule. What he was noticing was the fact that among the particulars worthy of our present attention, among the objects worth passing on, are many from remote times, while the scientific theory of remote times is of no contemporary scientific interest. That's the sense in which the arts are not progressive. And that's an important truth. But of course, ancient science can be an object of humanistic study because we are interested in those ancient theories in the way we are interested in ancient art and ancient literature. Because an understanding of them enriches us now, though the theories no longer hold our attention as guides to the nature of reality. That's why Darwin and Freud are now still read, but not in the biology and the psychology departments. Our practice presupposes that it's worth passing on an understanding of the intellectual, literary, and artistic practices of our predecessors, even when their theories have been shown to be scientifically untenable, and even when we have no interest in reproducing their arts or their poems. We pass them on because without this knowledge, the objects worth attending to are not intelligible. They cannot be explicated, absorbed, responded to in the ways that matter. It's a wonderful thing to be able to communicate the power, the intelligence, and the pathos of a Horatian ode, including, for example, the pathos of the fact that he was right when he wrote Exegi monumentum aere perennius, because the bronze memorials of his day are indeed few and far between, and we do have still every one of his Carmina. But the writing of a new ode in his style would be a mere curiosity. So unlike the nomothetes, we will always be holding on to the past because we hold the faith not just that much of what was done in the past is worth understanding for its own sake, but that because it is worth understanding, it is worth passing on. Ethics teaches us that a worthwhile life has to contain things worth doing. But that one thing worth doing is attending to these artifacts is a lesson learned by those who have been well taught in the humanities. And the humanities are intrinsically connected with teaching. Our study of them is connected with the need to understand them, but the need to understand them depends on the conviction that they are worth holding on to and passing on. Science does two kinds of work for us. It delivers understanding and it allows us technological progress. The understanding it offers is, like humanistic understanding, a thing of intrinsic value. And of course, as we've said several times today, rightly, the humanities do have utilitarian benefits. Well-trained English literature majors write better memos and movie scripts, both of which have market value. And they certainly write better ones than badly trained literature majors. And certainly they surely write better and more interesting than those who have not learned to read deeply and well. But the rest of what we humanists do lives or dies, unlike the work of the sciences, by whether we communicate what we do to each generation of students. The persuading them that these particulars whose understanding we profess are worthy objects of their contemporary attention. Some of the music and the movies and television of our own era is worth attending to, of course. And much contemporary culture does indeed draw our humanistic attention in exactly the way that an ode of Horace or a Tang poem or a chorale by Purcell might do. But it's harder to persuade many students of the virtues of these older objects. And my own view, as I hope I've made plain, is that persuading them is an essential part of the vocation of the humanist. We must speak to non-specialists because we must speak to the untrained young. And if our faith is warranted that what we offer them is something to take on into their lives beyond college, we have to persuade them. Now, I'm all for new methods, but they're in the service of a mission as old as Plato's Academy, to provide each new generation with the frameworks of understanding that will allow them to interpret a significant number of the many particulars that are our human heritage. That significant number is, as a moment's reflection reminds us, a diminishing proportion of what there is to explicate. When the scriptorium was replaced by the printing press, one of the limiting steps in the proliferation of writing was almost removed. When the internet became available, the barriers essentially came down completely. Now, each week here in Washington, thousands of times the number of pages that anyone could read in a lifetime are printed on paper, and millions of times that number are produced on the web. Once, to hear the range of music that I can scan in a few minutes on my car radio, I would have had to travel thousands of miles and been lucky to arrive for the right performances. The DVDs in my own house contain more hours of human acting than Pepys or Aubrey, both of them devoted theatregoers, ever saw in their entire lives. We are, in short, drowning in the particulars we humanists study. Surely now, in such a time, it is more urgent than ever to speak for what is finest in this flood of artifacts, so that those whom we can persuade to care for the magnificent particulars will spend the little time each of us has to attend to them well. In this time, more than in all earlier times, the civilization we live in needs the work of the humanist. If the evidence is increasingly that our fellow citizens doubt this, that is our fault, not theirs. For responding to this need is our vocation. It is our work. There are extraordinary new tools for that project available to us now. When I sat down to write this talk, I had P.P. Howe's edition of the works of Hazlitt to hand because it's part of our library at home. You, however, do not need to acquire this rare commodity. We had to wait for a Sotheby's auction to get it. There are only 1,000 copies, because most of Hazlitt is somewhere on the web. And I could check on the Latin prose and verse that I half remember from my youth, because on the Perseus website, from which I got not just the text, but also that dictionary and the cross-references for thinking about them, we have so much more to read, yes, but we also have, and we need to develop, more tools for finding things to read, more in the jargon. I speak as a member of the board of ARTstor that Neil Rudenstine chairs, more in the jargon metadata that helps us scan the gigabytes for the kilobyte we need now. Of course, we need a still richer store of materials in other traditions. There should be more text in Africa's hundreds of languages, for example, along with the dictionaries and grammars for those who do not speak them, to begin to make sense of them. But if you wanted to know why they should be there, why these African texts should be there alongside the others, I would direct you to something said by an African long ago, one of the sententiae left to us from the plays of Terence, P. Terentius Afer, P. Terentius the African, the Roman comedian of Berber ancestry. A line that Montaigne helped make famous later by inscribing it on the beams of his study. Homo sum humani a me nihil alienum puto. Now, it doesn't matter that in the Self-Tormentor, from which that line comes, this line is actually a high-minded defense of snooping on your neighbors. Because decontextualized, it has become one of the great cosmopolitan slogans of humanism. And when I started thinking about the ethical significance of our own ever more global society some years ago, it was an even older figure, Diogenes of Sinope, Diogenes the Cynic, who set me on the way. But as I said, it's our attention to the particulars that are our distinctive contribution. So let me end by exemplifying their power in a writer I just mentioned, namely Michel de Montaigne. Liberalism has at its heart, liberalism in the sense which I'm happy to continue to endorse resoundingly despite the attempt to make that word unsayable, Liberalism has at its heart the idea of the free man and woman, the person. And what matters, to put it the other way around, is not being unfree, not living like a slave. That's one reason why works like the autobiography of Frederick Douglass are crucial reading for an educated person. One dimension of freedom is being in charge of the making of your own life. And in the spirit of John Stuart Mill, who's been mentioned already, we should call that individuality. The individual is not a slave to a master, but also not a slave to a government, and also not a slave to public opinion. Mill worried that the opinions of masses of merely average men are everywhere becoming the dominant power, and that's a quote, and he wanted us to resist the tyranny of public opinion. So liberalism has both the doctrine that all people should be free and an interpretation of what freedom is and why it matters. But it also has at its core some disposition, some habits of mind, and principally these two, an abhorrence of cruelty and a sense of the provisional nature of human knowledge. And those tendencies of thought are everywhere evident in Montaigne's sensibility. And to see how distinctive he was, remember the times in which he lived. Religious strife raged in France throughout his adult life, including the infamous massacre of St. Bartholomew, when perhaps tens of thousands, no one knows exactly how many, were massacred in Paris and the provinces, and including in the area around Bordeaux, where Montaigne lives, and where, of course, he was mayor for a while. Montaigne was urging toleration at a time when you could be burned at the stake for an error in theology. And as he observed wryly, it is putting one's conjectures at a rather high price to burn a man alive for them. Taking aim in that one sentence, in a single shot, at both overconfidence and at cruelty, which he famously called the ultimate of the vices. Montaigne's response to cruelty was visceral before it was theoretical. For all his vaunted egoism, he had a gift for imaginative empathy, for putting himself in the shoes of another man and a woman. He also had a gift for accepting that his guesses were merely guesses. People often say that Montaigne and Descartes are the first modern philosophical skeptics, but in Montaigne's skepticism isn't a thesis, it's an attitude. If you wanted to label the position, you could say that Montaigne is a fallibilist. He believes we must always bear in mind our own endless capacity for error. Discussing the long-standing debates between geocentric and heliocentric astronomy, he writes in the characteristic moment, "Who knows but that a third opinion 1,000 years from now may overthrow the two former?" And of course, a third view, that motion is always relative to a frame, did indeed show up, and sooner than 1,000 years after Montaigne. These aspects of Montaigne's temperament, his resistance to cruelty, his fallibilism, are ones from which we and our students can still learn. They're liberal because they're part of the temperamental equipment of a free person who aims to live at peace among a free people. You learn them from an education ad humanitatem. We learn these things well from Montaigne because he coaxes, I would almost say, seduces us into his vision. The particulars of the essays are worth attending to in their own right, I say, but that is not to deny, as I've also insisted, that coming to know them has many other advantages. And these powerful lessons about the best way for men and women to live together as free people are among the benefits. But the reasons why the particulars are worth attending to, and the consequential benefits of that attention, are not just one, they are many. Indeed, I'm inclined to say they're indefinitely many. Which is why the case for the humanities is not one, but many-stranded, and why it is learned best through doing what we do, which is attending to some of the many things we claim demand the attention of a free person. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Happy to be with you. I've decided to summarize my talk. There's never been a culture without poetry, and I would like us not to be the ones who drop the ball. Alone with others. The word human is inextricably lodged inside the word humanities. It stubbornly adheres to it, a bodily memory. The concept of the human, which enrages so many postmodern thinkers, is the foundation of what we talk about when we talk about the humanities. so too the concept of humanity poignantly lurks within the idea of the humanities. The Latin humanitas or humanness pertain to human nature, the qualities and feelings characteristic of human beings. The question of the future of the humanities inevitably carries with it a question of the future of humanity, especially that much maligned figure, that relatively recent invention, the individual human being, solitary, fragmented, flawed, as well as of the larger collective, the social realm, the macrocosm of society itself. The burden of a gathering such as ours is to think not just about the nature of our studies, the future of what in the Renaissance was called the Studia Humanitatis, those collective fields deemed the humanities, which have their own common history and distinctive individual histories, but also about who we are and might become, what we think about and create, how we act in relationship to each other. Our existential condition suggests that each of us is fundamentally alone with others. The S.D. Wallace Stevens titled one of his poems, How to Live, What to Do. Education is first and foremost an act or process. It is secondarily a knowledge or skill developing out of that process. We risk being limited by an entirely empirical or instrumental view of knowledge geared exclusively toward profit. The arts and humanities provide us with a different kind of interpretive scope, a different mode of critical thinking, and open the space for another kind of creativity, which is a celebration of the unexpected, what D.W. Winnicott calls the doing that arises out of being. Robert Keegan contends that the world is made up of processes as much as entities, and he conceives of human being as an activity, the doing that a human is. That doing also includes the psychological necessity of play, the imaginative process of making something that didn't exist before, the sheer aesthetic thrill of it. And there's the shiver and bliss of encounter and immersion in a piece of music, say, which gives us a time-based experience, or a work of visual art, which gives us a spatial one. I believe that education in the humanities, which can never be completely quantified, puts us in a special kind of relationship. In a dehumanizing world, a humanly centered education first of all places us in relationship to ourselves, our interior and affective lives. The purpose of poetry, Cheswa Miłosz asserts in his poem Ars Poetica, is to remind us how difficult it is to remain just one person, for our house is open. There are no keys in the doors, and invisible guests come in and out at will. We are both familiar and strange to ourselves, riven creatures, and the integrity of the self, who anyone is at any given moment, is always at risk, perennially under assault. Our education places us in relationship to various fields of knowledge, to particular domains of learning, the nature of people acting in groups, for example, or the history of politics, or the character of religious life, and also to each other. Our education in what Nietzsche playfully calls the unnatural sciences suggests that what's closest and most familiar to us is in some ways the hardest to understand, as he formulates it in The Gay Science. The familiar is what we are used to, and what we are used to is the most difficult to know, that is, to view as a problem, to see as strange, as distant, as outside us. The great certainty of the natural sciences in comparison with psychology and the critique of the elements of consciousness with the unnatural sciences, one might almost say, rests precisely on the fact that they take the strange as their object, while it is nearly contradictory and even absurd even to want to take the not strange as one's object. The arts especially estrange and defamiliarize reality. Literature gives us fictive stories. It represents imagined lives, and it provides us with what Kenneth Burke calls equipment for living. The humanities offer critical models and forms to think with, questions and interpretations that connect us on a human level. Relationship is based on a mutuality of interests. One should not try to dilute the meaning of the relation, Martin Buber states in his treatise, I and Thou. Relationship is reciprocity. We become more fully ourselves. Indeed, we make something of ourselves in full relationship to each other. Empathy matters. We construct meaning between us. These abilities are associated with the humanities and the arts, Martha Nussbaum explains in Not for Profit. The ability to think critically, the ability to transcend local loyalties and to approach world problems as a citizen of the world. And finally, the ability to imagine sympathetically the predicament of another person. I believe that we are not fully given our humanity. Rather, our humanity is something to be attained, something to be strived for. We aspire to become deeper human beings, to evolve more fully. My own vocation, my chosen life work, is poetry. And I believe that poetry in particular, and art in general, enables us to dramatize, enact, and connect our inner and outer lives. Poetry delights, disturbs, confronts, consoles. It presents us with what John Keats calls the holiness of the heart's affections and the truth of imagination. I am thinking here both of oral and written poetry, which provide two different communicative models. The oral poem is a particular mode of communication usually transmitted by word of mouth and performed in face-to-face interaction. It is a verbal art characterized by a heightened awareness of the act of expression, how it says what it says. And it is marked, framed, and identified by the community as poetry. It is an emergent art that unfolds in performance. It binds people together through language. Oral poetry includes miniature genres such as the proverb, a short pithy saying that takes a personal circumstance and embodies it in impersonal form. The linguist Roman Jakobson calls it the largest coded unit occurring in our speech and at the same time the shortest poetic composition. The proverb is normative, consensual, live and learn, live and let live. It is connected to the riddle, it's in verse form. The riddle, which is probably the earliest form of oral literature, the oldest riddles on record are preserved on a clay tablet from ancient Babylon, is both an interrogative and an expressive form. It poses a question and misleads by indirection. It draws attention to our cognitive categories, a formulation of thought, a mode of association, a metaphor. Whereas the proverb is reassuring and reinforces social wisdom, the riddle creates a situation that is vexing, verbally aggressive, socially disruptive. It uses small things to illuminate large mysteries. Here, for example, is a Persian riddle that gives a feeling of sudden liberation, like a Japanese haiku. A blue napkin full of pears. The sky. Oral literature includes larger narrative forms, such as the ballad, where the individual singer stands in for the community, serving as the deputy of a public voice, and the epic, a long narrative poem exalted in style, heroic in theme, that tells a representative story. The epic is inherently nostalgic. It looks back to greater and more heroic times, the emergence of tribes, the founding of countries, the deeds of legendary figures. It moves beyond individual experience and harkens back to an outsized communal past. It instills a sense of collective grandeur. Poetry is a highly concentrated verbal medium, a form of imaginative thinking, a type of rapid acceleration in language, and the words of the poem are a means of connection, a chosen method of transport. The written poem, especially the lyric, my own domain, fixes the evanescence of sound in print. It foregrounds language as a medium. The poem takes on a concrete visual as well as auditory life. The written lyric is a passionate form of communication between strangers. The Russian poet Osip Mandelstam spoke of the mutual relationship, the contractual agreement that obtains between the poet and the reader. the writer, and the hidden addressee of a literary text. Mandelstam writes, "At a critical moment, a seafarer tosses a sealed bottle into the ocean waves containing his name and a message detailing his fate. Wandering along the dunes many years later, I happen upon it in the sand. I read the message, note the date, the last will and testament of one who has passed on. I have the right to do so. I have not opened someone else's mail. The message in the bottle was addressed to its finder. I found it. That means I have become its secret addressee." As a reader, I am overwhelmed by a sense of providence when I discover an uncanny message in a bottle, a poem that speaks to no one in particular and therefore seems unexpectedly addressed to me. The discovery has the element of freedom, the fresh air of surprise, of speaking from the known into the unknown. It is a gift from a human beyond, but one that the reader, in turn, daydreams into existence and expands with thought, blooding with experience, gifting with intimate life. The German-speaking poet Paul Celan was strongly influenced by Mandelstam's key notion that, though individual poems, such as epistles and dedications, may be addressed to concrete persons, poetry as a whole is always directed toward a more or less distant, unknown addressee. There's something secretive in it. Poetry may seek transcendence, but it always does so with a human horizon, since, however uncertainly, the writer nonetheless posits a future reader, a distant heir, as surely as a speaker implies a listener. Thus Celan suggested that the poem may claim the infinite, but it always does so by reaching through time, not above and beyond it. He echoed Mandelstam when he wrote, "A poem as a manifestation of language, and thus essentially dialogue, can be a message in a bottle, sent out in the not always greatly hopeful belief that somewhere and sometime it could be washed up on land, on Heartland perhaps. Poems in this sense too are underway. They are making towards something. The poem is en route," Celan suggests, "sometimes for centuries, and longs for a hearing. It survives by moving towards something open, inhabitable, an approachable you perhaps, an approachable reality. The poem is lonely," he says, "and it breathes, it inhales and exhales in a mystery of encounter." The dynamic between the writer and the reader is what Buber characterizes as a greeting of human spirits. In the beginning is the relation, Buber argues. The relation precedes the word because it's authored by the human. Or as Rainer Maria Rilke put it in a letter, instead of possession, one learns relation. Rilke, Mandelstam, and Celan all teach us that lyric poetry can only exist in dialogue one-on-one, in just such a human form of greeting and recognition, in relationship. Poetry is a non-utilitarian form of knowledge that teaches us to move beyond the literal and think metaphorically. Robert Frost considered a form of education by metaphor. It is a species of play spiritually dependent upon the dynamic relationship that exists between two unknowns, writer and reader. That's why the Russian poet Marina Tsvetaeva suggested that reading is complicity in the creative process. One might say that the poet and the reader of poetry are bound together by a necessary consensual compact, by the ways in which they employ lyric poetry itself to exchange dizzying signals, urgent and disturbing messages, some of them social and historical. Think of protest poetry or the warnings of the biblical prophets, some strange and otherworldly. Mandelstam said that exchanging signals with the planet Mars is a task worthy of a lyric poet. Poetry connects us more deeply to ourselves, even as it connects us more fully to others. It delivers on our spiritual lives precisely because it gives us the gift of intimacy and interiority, of privacy and participation. It is a form of dynamic spiritual exchange. Poetry pitches persons towards one another full of news. Our inner lives have been given form. We are enabled to achieve more fully our own personhood. These two modes of literary connection, of aesthetic encounter, the oral and the written, one face-to-face, the other physically removed, provide us with two models of human engagement, two ways of helping us to live in the world. We are interdependent. On a human scale, they address both the inevitability of our separate solitudes and the necessary consolation of intimate interchange between individuals. Like the humanities in general, poetry teaches a species of understanding that relies not on quantifiable certainties, but on nuance, ambiguity, and complexity. It employs modes of expression and discernment that are not measurable and cannot be grasped formulaically. It requires the exercise of critical thinking and evaluative judgments. And it assumes that all of us must navigate our relationships with each other and with our environments. We must develop our deepest convictions about how to live ethically by means of emotion, interpretation, intuition, and imagination. In an increasingly technological world, the empathic connections fostered by the humanities become ever more than ever a necessity for our survival and for our very future. We too must figure out how to live and what to do. Thank you.
You'll never see me where you're seated, but I won't see you either. Maybe I'll start by at least beginning the conversation in response to our moderator's questions. The first one being, is there evidence for the claims that we make about the humanities, or are we simply spouting articles of faith? I think there's evidence, but it's a little bit like obscenity. You know it when you see it, but it's not necessarily easily defined or quantified. And the second question was interesting. Do humanities fall short of the claims we make? Yes, and if you listen to nothing else in my remarks, please listen to the last paragraph. I'll try to address that. And thirdly, to what extent are the humanities responsible for our own problems? And I think in some respects we're responsible because we make much too sharp a distinction between the good of the humanities in themselves on the one hand, and on the other hand, the practical and pragmatic ways in which the humanities are worth our attention. And I hope that we will get a chance to talk about those questions. I thought they were important. This symposium on the future of the humanities might easily be seen as a celebration of the humanities, and in some sense it is. But the symposium is also a response to trends in higher education which suggest that the humanities curriculum as the core of undergraduate education might be more at risk than ever. To paraphrase the compelling invitation to this symposium from Richard Ekman and Azar Nafisi, the symposium is a response to the marginalization of the liberal arts in undergraduate education and to disquieting patterns away from the humanities in undergraduate enrollments, funding of advanced research, and trends in philanthropy. This should put anyone who is serious about the importance of education to individuals and to the societies to which they belong in anything but a celebratory mood. As individuals and as a society, we should be seriously concerned about the future of the humanities. This is because the study of the humanities is not a luxury, as it is too often made out to be, but a crucial ingredient in the transformation of young adults into genuine learners, by which I mean learners whose passion for learning comes from accessing their own questions about the facts and ideas with which they are confronted. The impact of such learning is not limited to the undergraduate years and has implications not just for how one makes a living, but for how one lives a life. While the humanities may and even must be promoted in their own right, they must also be promoted insofar as their study converges simultaneously on individual development and on social well-being by cultivating learners. For full disclosure, I offer the judgment that the humanities are crucial for making students into learners
from nothing more than nearly 20 years of teaching and learning with students at St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I say teaching and learning because faculty at St. John's are expected to teach, and therefore learn, across a virtually all-required curriculum, which includes both classes that are typically understood to fall within the purview of the humanities and classes considered outside of that purview, classes in mathematics and the sciences, for example. That is, we don't accept the argument about the two cultures. There are no departments at St. John's and no majors, and so students work across the curriculum together, even as faculty teach and learn outside of their specialized disciplines. The expectation is that everyone is at the college to learn together, from one another to be sure, but especially from foundational works within and outside the humanities as they're traditionally conceived. This affords the St. John's faculty member a unique perspective on student learning, one which transcends departmentalization in observing the student as learner, and one which places the humanities in relief as a kind of conduit for student learning. I offer my remarks today in light of that perspective. What I have observed is that in classes typically understood as outside the humanities, students often start out more inhibited in their attempts to ask their own questions. They come to the college having accepted that those areas of study have fixed answers and methods to which they may or may not be privy. If privy, then why ask questions? If not privy, then more study and memorization is needed, not questions that would expose ignorance of what is already known by others. Our students get past these inhibitions and do in fact find that they have questions for the likes of Euclid, Ptolemy, Newton, Einstein, as they do for Lavoisier, Maxwell, and Schrödinger. And here's what I have observed about how they come to have the confidence to get past their inhibitions. They practice in the humanities. They practice by asking questions of Homer, Plato, and Sophocles, Livy, Aquinas, and Shakespeare, Descartes, Austin, and Tocqueville, Nietzsche, Du Bois, and Woolf. That is, even when young adults are faced with daunting works and big ideas in the humanities, they just can't seem to help asking their own questions. They can't help engaging the humanities from whatever standpoint they currently occupy. Why might this be the case if in fact it is? Why might undergraduates, not just St. John's students who are admittedly self-selected, be poised to find their passion and therefore independence as learners through an encounter with the humanities? The short answer is that the humanities are concerned with the human. By this, I mean at least two things that bear on why the study of the humanities might be vital to cultivating a passion for learning, perhaps especially at the level of undergraduate education. First, the subject matter of the humanities is the human in all of its rich and difficult manifestations. Second, the humanities invite us to engage in learning about the human in the most human of ways, through the discourse of inquiry, which is in some deep sense pre-methodological and therefore maximally free. For both of these reasons, the humanities lend themselves to the unique situation of young adults engaged in undergraduate education. And of course, I wouldn't say that the humanities are only relevant at that age. My sense as a mother is that I haven't done my job unless I've made my children so anxious about their own existence that they're desperate for the humanities by the time they get to college. And of course, that continues into adult life. But I wanted to focus specifically on undergraduate education. So to begin with the subject matter of the humanities. Having experienced the alienation and fragmentation that largely characterize adolescent experience, young adults seem to hunger after an account of the human which holds out the possibility of a sense of belonging and a wholeness that might actually be within their grasp. To encounter the human as a question, then, is to encounter something of deep importance to them. It is to encounter a field for questioning that might actually restore something they've lost or offer a path for going forward. But it is to encounter such deep and important possibilities without immediate personal risk, insofar as the questions transcend the personal particularity of the inquirer, even as they expose it. This is not to say that students know self-consciously that the humanities hold out this possibility, let alone that they are motivated to study the humanities for the sake of this search or recovery. But my experience suggests that even without this self-conscious knowledge or motivation, the humanities grab them nevertheless. The humanities meet students where they are, as they are, so to speak. And the practice they afford in asking one's own questions for the sake of one's own learning spills into areas where the subject matter is not so immediately accessible or personally pressing. To go on to the approach invited by the humanities. Entering the world as free agents, many if not most of them for the first time, typical undergraduates are just finding their own voices. What they do not bring to this discovery is just as important as what they do bring. They bring with them little in the way of specialized methods of approach, which frankly can be more constricting than liberating. But they bring much in the way of newly developing powers of analysis, critical thinking, and an openness to speculation about what was once taken for granted, but which now for them is riddled with questions. By finding themselves free to engage with serious, universal, and yet intimate questions posed by the humanities, armed only with what everyone else in the room has access to simply in virtue of being human and not in virtue of being learned in special methods, young adults have the greatest hope of learning to think and to question for themselves. Whether the subject matter is a language or a piece of literature or a philosophical argument or theological treatise, it becomes open to student inquiry when it is presented first and foremost as a reflection on the human condition, accessible through the reflection of human beings. And inquiry is the purview of all who would be learners. By engendering learners, the humanities are crucial not only for the development of the individual, but for the health of the society at large. The independent appropriation of received opinions is surely one hallmark feature of the development of the individual. The only way to appropriate received opinion for oneself is to cultivate habits of mind that allow one to look at things from a variety of perspectives and with the various human faculties freely in play: intellect, imagination, understanding, and judgment. I have suggested that these habits are formed in important ways by encountering expressions of the human condition that are rich enough to engage with one's own questions, ideas whose power is that they are simultaneously universal and particular, simultaneously able to be considered at a distance and able to be internalized in their intimate importance. I've also suggested that by being simultaneously of the most serious and important nature and yet utterly accessible, the ideas one confronts in the humanities are freeing. They free students to ask questions, to engage in conversation, to speculate. In short, they free them to participate in the most human of activities in ways that are prior to any specialized methodological approach and the parameters they impose on inquiry. What this means for the individual is no less than the deepening of her humanity, the maturation of her critical points of access to herself, others, and the world. This insight into how the humanities matter for cultivating habits of mind and of discourse makes for an interesting and in some ways surprising answer to one of the many important questions we were asked to consider in preparing our remarks for this panel. How do the humanities clarify conceptions of humanity, morality, freedom, civility, and imagination? Directly, to be sure, the humanities clarify such conceptions because they bring them to light. They make thematic these conceptions in myriad ways that invite various forms of consideration: philosophical, literary, political, historical, linguistic, artistic. But indirectly, the story may be even more interesting. The humanities clarify such conceptions because they engage us in activities that embody and bring to life those conceptions. They humanize us by calling us into moral relationships with authors and with characters and with one another in our considerations of them. They humanize us by calling us into the exercise of freedom through the fundamentally important activity of questioning ourselves. They humanize us by stripping away the divide between experts and amateurs, making the practice of civility crucial if we are to have hope of distinguishing between true and false opinions, about important questions with no simple answers. That human beings come to their social interactions and responsibilities, having thought critically about their received opinions, is of inestimable importance, as is the extent to which a society values the importance of genuine learners in informing its political and social structures. It takes a learner to confront change when it presents itself, even as it takes a learner to initiate change. And change is the stuff of our existence as social beings. Whether due to natural or technological disasters, as we've so painfully witnessed in Japan, or because of political and social upheaval, as we have been watching in Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain, Libya, and Syria, or because of economic reversal, such as we've seen in our own country and in Europe, human beings are continually confronted by change. Our ability to meet change is intimately connected to our ability to question what it means, to understand it, to judge it, and especially to imagine what a response to it might look like given who we are and what we care about. And it is intimately connected to our ability to communicate that response through civil discourse. The humanities, then, aren't just necessary to a healthy democracy. They are perhaps even more necessary to a democracy in a state of ill health, one fragmented and fractured. How much more necessary are they in societies that don't even yet have the structures in place to make civil discourse possible? In calling to consciousness the ways in which the humanities are vital to the cultivation of learners, and therefore to the development of the individual and the health of society, I in no way mean to suggest that the humanities are all that should be taught, or that approached naively they alone can prepare our students for the future. The sciences and the social sciences, technical and vocational schools, and the myriad specialized approaches to the humanities that frankly constitute the training of most of us in this room, all have a place in developing individuals and in helping them to take their place in society. But I would argue that for every one of these approaches to education, the student who has been introduced to the humanities and allowed to explore them as openly as possible will be distinguished. Never mind that such a student also has the best hope to enjoy the unique pleasures that come through the study of the humanities. Perhaps that is a luxury of sorts, though one I wish for every human being on the planet. But it is hardly a luxury to explore one's humanity and to exercise it. It should hardly be a luxury to be afforded the opportunity to become a learner, to think, and to question for oneself. If the humanities are at risk, it may be in part the fault of those of us who teach the humanities. Perhaps we have become a little too anxious to dress up the humanities to look like the sciences, focused as they are on specialized methods. Perhaps we have gotten too caught up in passing on those methods and the views they support, when in fact the point of contact between our students and the works to which we introduce them is simpler and more straightforward, a matter simply and straightforwardly of encountering the human humanly. If this is true, and we are willing to stand up for the humanities not just as goods in themselves, but as the vital ingredient they are in the cultivation of learners, then the risk to the future of the humanities might be reversed. Would that enrollments, funding, and trends in philanthropy might follow our lead. In a very real sense, our future depends on it.
I think I'll follow John Churchill's lead by throwing out a question, or asking you to throw out questions first to one another, and then we can open up discussion from the floor. I think we're going to turn it open to the floor. Yes.
If I oversimplify, forgive me, but to some degree the three, that makes life easier. So far, the 6 talks we have heard have an underlying theme, namely, how do we sell the humanities? And the speakers have all told us in one way or another what the humanities are good for. What I have missed so far, and this is a comment rather than a question, is the enjoyment to be derived from the objects that the humanities study and the pleasure derived from the studying of them and the dealing with them in a variety of ways. I appreciate a reaction.
When you're cutting a talk down to make it only 10 minutes too long, one of the things you leave out is often the thing that the first question is about. So, I mean, in a longer version, I did talk a bit about what Swift called sweetness and light. I mean, the fact that, and I tried to hint at it in the fact that one reason for learning certain things from Montaigne, rather than from some fine professor telling us what Montaigne said, has to do with the way in which Montaigne says it, and the fact that he's a seductive writer. He draws us in, and so I think pleasure is one of the rewards of reading. Of course, there are many other rewards of reading which are not well characterized by speaking of pleasure. Not because they're unpleasurable, but because there are other more important things going on than pleasure. But pleasure is obviously, yes, an important part of it. And this is back to the question of the higher pleasures, as Mill called them, are among the things that make a human life go well. And so, and nobody tells you that if you don't. I mean, you may figure it out for yourself. Many people do, but you won't. They're not going to tell you that in the economics classes. So.
I just want to object to the first part of your question. I don't think we're selling the humanities. I don't think the humanities are for sale. I think we're advocating on behalf of a certain way of thinking, of a certain kind of knowledge. And I think that we live in the reason I'm objecting is because I think we live in a culture where everything is for sale. And I think our argument is not to sell something. It's to make the case for something that can't be sold and can't be bought.
Yeah, and I think connected to that, it's important to realize that pleasure isn't the only reason for the humanities, though it's certainly a real one. But I think oftentimes young people don't yet know that they can just take pleasure in something, and that's a worth in itself. But I think along the points about not selling the humanities, it is the case that the humanities immediately, whether one takes pleasure in them or not, matter. One can see that they matter. And that might be a point of access as well, not just pleasure.
Yes. Would you wait for the microphone and also identify yourself, please? Thank you.
I'm Jonathan Arick from the University of Pittsburgh. I have one brief comment on a very large topic that may get some discussion now or may come up later in the day more, and then a second point. The first one is to say that although the humanities may not be bought or sold, they certainly may be supported. And one of the questions about the future of the humanities, not the only one at all, but certainly in the United States now, involves questions of support levels for the universities that are an important, although by no means the only place where the humanities are practiced and flourish. And I would just like to say, I suppose polemically, except I don't think people will disagree, but I think it's important to say, that, for example, in my state, the governor's new budget cuts funding for higher education by 50%. That's not the humanities that have been cut, that's higher education. And one part of the future of the humanities is our working together with our colleagues in all the other areas of learning. So, very brief point, very big topic. The other question, I suppose, has to do with Anthony Appiah's cosmopolitanism in time and space. Having Cicero and Terence quoted to us in Latin, having Celan and Rilke and Mandelstam and others brought to us in English, having the curriculum of St. John's briefly sketched for us, reminds us that the question of the many languages of the world is a very important part of thinking about humanities and their future. And I will just give a very brief exemplum of how cosmopolitanism in space and cosmopolitanism in time can interact strangely. The humanities literature course at Columbia University, where I used to teach, primarily operates on translations of great works from the Greeks to near the present. And it's committed to reading whole works, and it's committed to doing it fast. The idea being precisely that the human connection makes it possible to have preliminary discussions on books that you'll be reading all your life. Well, it used to be that John Milton's Paradise Lost was part of the curriculum. It no longer is. Meditation on this led me to conclude you can read Richmond Lattimore's Iliad in a week, but you can't read John Milton's Paradise Lost in a week. The translation has brought the distant very close to us, but the fact of our sharing the English language with John Milton has made his work surprisingly distant. And this seems a set of issues worth our attention in many respects.
Jeffrey, would again, wait for the microphone and identify yourselves, please.
Jeffrey Brown from the PBS NewsHour. My question reflects my background in news and public affairs. I want to just ask a more direct question that seems to be lingering in the background. Maybe it's just a given. Why is it that as we talk about the value of the humanities, something that I very much share, by the way, but why is this value not well understood and valued by the public? And this is at a time where there are more people in college and universities than ever, more graduates than ever. And to point the question even more, to what extent is it due to the neglect or the inability or lack of desire of our humanists, our scholars, and our artists to speak directly to the public in a public language?
I can try that. I think two things. One, I think that our language of value has become wholly economic. I mean, I think what we mean by value is really a kind of economic meaning. And so you do get tempted to think in terms of, getting people to buy the humanities or selling the humanities. I think, secondly, that in higher education, we've really come to take for granted the vocational model as the only model for education. It's a means to an end, and we've forgotten that education might be a good in itself, but also a means to an end that's not immediately available and not immediately valuable in economic terms, that has something to do with the human being, as a human being. And so I think those are the reasons that we find ourselves in the position we are, because we don't even think anymore about education on anything but a vocational model, even in the humanities, it seems to me.
But I think that you're sort of, maybe one of the premises of today's meeting is that we haven't made our case very well. And we haven't made our case very well outside the academy. And we would make it well within the academy to some extent, but we haven't made it well outside the academy. And there are large forces at work here that are beyond anyone's quite understanding, I think, in terms of the way capitalism has moved and in terms of what our culture has found itself. And a lot of things have moved very quickly without much understanding. But I think that people on our side of the fence haven't stood up and made our case very well to uninitiated readers, thinkers, people in the larger public. And I think that's something we can do, and I think it's something we need to do.
I think it's a very hard question. I mean, I said it's in some sense it must be our fault, because it's our job to explain these things, and if the explanation hasn't come across, then we're bad explainers, and we should accept that responsibility and just try to do a better job. But remember, we live in a civilization where a major American novel is doing well if it sells 100,000 copies in a country of 300 million people. And not many books, even passionate, intelligent, outwardly directed works like the works of Martha Nussbaum. I'm not her publisher, I don't know what those books sell, but I very much doubt that they sell, even though many of them are used in classes, which is one of the main ways you get sales if you write academic books, sell on that scale. Wonderful, wonderful novels are published in this country every year that are bought by 10,000 people. I mean, and reviewed. They're reviewed in the New York Review of Books. I mean, they're reviewed in serious places. So there's a problem about kind of what the educated public is. Part of the reason that a successful work of serious fiction gets 100,000 readers is because there's a lot of good works of serious fiction, and if you add up all the sales, there are millions of them, except that it's probably the same 100,000 people reading most of them. So I think we have to be realistic about sort of what our civilization is like. As far as one of the reasons why I think we have a hard time explaining these things is because if the value of the humanities is connected with these particular things, and each of them it's worth explaining about each of them what's wonderful, and it's a different explanation in each case, then the argument is complicated. And we have a very hard time making complicated arguments about anything in our civilization, not just about the humanities, but about Libya or about the economy, about anything. And that's not something that we humanists by ourselves can do anything about. I mean, we are citizens, we can contribute to arguing for more complicated, more nuanced discussion, and by rewarding people who provide it, by voting for the congressman one of whose answers is, I don't know, which is a very unusual answer to hear from a public figure. But in the end, and which is, the sort of thing a person who thinks things are complicated might say. But I think, I was once at the Council on Foreign Relations, and I was asked a question, and I said, I don't know. And the president of the Council on Foreign Relations said, nobody's ever said that here before.
Doesn't work on television either.
Yes. So I think people should say it more often. But also I think they should say, you want a simple answer, there isn't a simple answer, I'll start the complicated answer, and you'll just have to stop me when we run out of time. So I think there is a structural difficulty about explaining that. You see, you can give a kind of crude, utilitarian, and I think completely misleading defense of the sciences by talking about, Moore's law and microchips and nuclear reactors. But that's a terrible way, really, to understand what the value of science is to our civilization, in my view. But still, it sort of works. But I don't think, we don't believe any of those simple answers about what the point is of reading a poem. We don't believe that anyone should explain poetry to you in less than the amount of time that Ed Hirsch just took, and we should have given him more. So I think there's a problem about it's part of the sort of, as it were, our temperament of mind is not one that's designed for speaking to a civilization that has decided that 15 seconds is the longest explanation that anything deserves.
Mark.
Mark Bauerlein. This takes a little bit up from Jeffrey's question, and maybe on what Professor Appia said. You praised liberalism as really the dominant position of our time that gives people the chance to live their own lives and make up their own minds about things. And at the same time, you granted humanities teachers the authority and the duty to select and promote the finer products of our culture, somewhat against all the rest. Is there a tension there that needs finessing, that may have operated perhaps to the disadvantage of the humanities in the culture wars of recent memory?
Well, the task is to, as it were, articulate what's valuable about the things you value. Not everybody's going to be persuaded, and it's not your job to it's your job, I think, to equip people to make these evaluations. I don't think telling people that, as it were, I don't know, Chaucer's better, Gamma-Gurton's needle is not as good as Hamlet. I mean, I don't think just sort of announcing evaluations or getting people to make evaluations is the thing. What you need is to get them to give them the tools to come to their own conclusions about what's valuable. But you do that by figuring out what is valuable in the domain that you work on and presenting it and showing how one goes about evaluating it. And that is, but the democratic thought is, which should be there all the time, is that in the end, each of us has to make our own judgment about these things. You hear from a prepared teacher. You are in dialogue with people who have other things to contribute to your understanding. But in the end, you have responsibility for your own judgment. We have to help people, give them the tools for making their own judgments, but it's not our job to make the judgments for them or to tell them in some sense what judgments to make. We have to prepare them to make their own judgments. And in that sense, it's compatible with democracy to believe in a kind of expertise. Our expertise is, I think my evaluations of philosophical arguments are worth more than those of the average undergraduate in my classes. But in the end, the point of the class is that they should evaluate arguments, not that they should borrow my evaluations.
We're over time, but I'm going to indulge us because we want to continue the conversation and have one more question.
Thank you so much for the indulgence. I'm a former English professor, Mimi Bernard, with the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities. My love of John Donne set me on that path. Thank you so much for today, but I do feel like as a member of the choir, we are preaching to the choir. This feels like a luxurious exercise, but in my gut, I know that it's not. I would ask the panel if they're familiar with Mark Taylor's new book, Crisis on Campus, A Bold Plan for Reforming Our Colleges and Universities. He's Columbia. In it, he talks about the academy becoming more and more...
Did he put you up to that question?
No, he did not. But he did sign my copy of my real book. I have a Kindle that I should use more. The academy has become more and more specialized. That's how we reward people within the academy, is for that specialization. And at the same time, back in historically, higher ed was once only for the privileged, but now we have a numbers problem because we have more and more students, less and less really good teaching, less funding for that really good teaching, and even for poor teaching. It's a conundrum. And I would say that I've been Facebooking my students, and they love the Wikipedia comment. Thank you.
Well, at this point, I think we really should call it quits because we have our lunch waiting for us, but we'll continue this conversation. I know there are a number of people who would like to ask some questions. When we return, and we will reconvene at 1:30, lunch is in the back, and then we'll reconvene at 1:30, the next two panels will make a case on a policy level, and I think it's a natural follow-up from what we've been doing this morning. So let's eat, let's talk, and let's reconvene at 1:30 sharp. Thank you.
Excellent talk.